Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Deku had a healing quirk fueled by pain. Here is short summary. Izuku manifests a incredibly strong healing quirk named Sympatheic Healing. A quirk that allows him to heal people as long as he himself is in some sort of pain. Izuku is excited as it will be an amazing hero with this quirk. Inko is terrified. Years down the line, Hawks is taken to a hidden HPSC facility after being injured and meets a fluffy green bean of a child. Hawks won't let another child be under the HPSC's thumb and vows to get him out of there, even though he feels way out of his depth the whole time. Aizawa is roped into a dangerous rescue mission. On paper it is for one child, but he knows that this is actually a rescue of one child and one young hero. His protective instincts might seem excessive to some, but he thinks it's only logical. His fiance thinks it's cute. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Izuku was having a bad day. Not like it was terrible or anything, but the 4-year-old woke up to his mom loudly talking through the door that he was going to be late for daycare, which made the little boy startle and scramble to get out from the tangle of blankets and plushies. Instead of a smooth trip out of bed, Izuku ended up falling and slamming into the ground hard. Worst yet, he had ignored his mom's promptings to pick up his toys and he landed on top of one of his All Might action figures. Not only did he break off the arm, but it also left some painful bruises and even a small cut from where his cheek scraped across the pointed plastic signature hairstyle of the #1 hero. Izuku was a big boy and didn't cry much. For him, which for most would probably be considered a lot. But who could blame him? It was his favorite Bronze Era figure. It was a gift from Kachan and he broke it. And not only that, it really hurt. Once the little boy had calmed down, his mom told him that they were now running late and that instead of being able to sit and eat at the table, Izuku would have to take his breakfast to go and eat it once he got to daycare. However, Izuku knew that the rule was that you could only eat at meal and snack times. So Izuku wouldn't be able to eat breakfast until it was cold. And no one wants to eat cold eggs. And Izuku was hungry now. He didn't want to have to wait until later. The train ride was fine except for the fact there was a guy asking people about their quirks, as apparently he wanted to thank someone about something. It was weird and the man wouldn't stop asking him and his mom questions. Apparently the man was convinced that Izuku had manifested his quirk, which wouldn't make sense, as Izuku didn't do anything today except be cranky and break his toys. And if that was his quirk, he didn't want it. Finally he made it to daycare and it was once again bad. Ms. Kendo told Izuku he couldn't eat his breakfast even though he explained about the toy and being late and the man on the train. He was told only at meal times he was allowed to eat, and that Izuku was usually a good boy and knew the rules. And that made him cry, which led to Yuri making fun of Izuku for being a crybaby, which then caused Kachan to get angry, which always sets off his quirk. And the sparks from Kachan's hands then left burns on Mezzo, who then cried because burns hurt. Izuku couldn't help but feel it was all his fault for crying, so during break time he went over to apologize to the still sniffling boy. "Sorry you got hurt." Izuku pointed to the bandages on his arm. "How is it feeling?" "It's feeling a lot better actually." Mezzo wiped his eyes before poking the bandages. "Actually they feel good." Izuku's face broke into a large grin. "I'm glad. Burns hurt." Mezzo nodded slowly, lost in thought. He was poking his arm again and again. It was a little weird. "Do you want to play heroes and villains with me? I think my burn is gone." "What?" Izuku gaped at the little boy, before screaming, "Did your quirk just come in?" Izuku flapped his hands around excitedly. "A self-healing quirk is amazing. Regeneration is super helpful in heroics. What a cool quirk. I wonder if it only works on burns. Or maybe it is a speed thing, as you didn't heal right away. Or maybe there is some other activation thingy to make it happen. Ooh, are you gonna go to a quirk doctor to see?" Mezzo waved his hands in Izuku's face, stopping his excited ramble. "My quirk has already come in. I am able to help plants grow faster." "Oh." Izuku slumped forward a little, disappointed. Healing quirks are fairly rare, so that would have been super cool. Izuku's eyes widened. Not like your quirk isn't super cool. It really is. Plant manipulation is also big in heroics too. And is also good for other things too. Mezzo nodded. I actually have a cousin who is working to get into Shiketsu's hero course. He can control wood and is super cool. That is so cool. You are gonna have a pro hero in your family. Mezzo grinned. I know. Nishia is amazing. And I want to be like him. Izuku nodded like a bobblehead. So you wanna play? Sure. Izuku's day got a little better after that, at least until he was supposed to be headed home. His mom was running a little late due to a hero fight delaying the trains, which was a bummer. Izuku liked to watch that sort of thing, but maybe if he got home quickly he could watch the recap on Hero News. Izuku was waiting outside the daycare, sitting by a tree and picking at the grass when the little boy heard shouting from the distance. Give it back. Izuku twisted to look behind him. He saw a group of 3 older elementary-aged kids laughing and holding a notebook over a 4th shorter kid. The one holding the notebook sneered. Why don't you make me, or are you too chicken? The kid let out a mocking chuckle. Oh wait, you weakless Q-nah-s can't fight someone with a strong quirk like me. Oh little quirkless is crying, so pathetic. One of the bullies practically spat out. Why don't you just leave and never come back? I doubt he even knows what is happening, the geneless are pretty dumb you know. I am sure I can teach him that he is useless garbage. The kid holding the notebook grinned as they held up the notebook. The kid took a large breath and blew a jet of fire onto the book. The thin book quickly went up in flames, little flakes of ash blowing away in the slight breeze. The shorter kid's fists tightened at their side. Izuku could see how those fists were shaking as the main bully crumpled the black ashes of the book, cackling with the other bullies. The shorter boy snapped, tackling the fire-quirked kid to the ground, punching the kid a few times before the other bullies jumped in, pulling him off the other bully. Izuku's mouth gaped. Jumping up he started to run over. Izuku watched as the 3 bullies started punching and kicking the other kid, who was now curled up on the ground. His arms were protecting his head as the other kids screamed mean things at him. Izuku took a deep breath and shouted as loud as he could as he continued to barrel towards the group of bullies. Leave him alone, you bullies. The bullies paused and looked up. One stepped back and grinned. Oh Lucky geneless, you have to get pipsqueak like him too. Izuku's body slammed the bigger kid, who stumbled but didn't fully fall to the ground. Izuku reached out, grabbing the arm of the kid and chomped down on the yellow skin. The young boy grimaced, as the skin tasted bitter. The kid howled and pried him off, throwing Izuku to the ground. Twerp just bit me. The yellow kid stomped over to Izuku and placed a heavy foot onto the little boy's chest. You are going to regret that. The kid proceeded to stomp down on Izuku's chest. The little boy gasped as a bright spark of pain shot out from where the thick sole slammed into his sternum. Izuku tried to roll away only for the kid to kick his arm. Izuku heard a loud cracking sound even over the sound of his loud sobs. Izuku curled up on himself, not really paying attention, just glad that the attack stopped. I think that was his arm. We gotta get out of here. The little boy listened as the sounds of quick steps slowly faded away. Izuku curled up tighter, holding onto the throbbing arm close to his chest. He bit his lower lip as he whimpered, moving his arm hurt so bad. Hey, you okay? A soft voice came from above. Dumb question. Where does it hurt the worst? Izuku blinked his eyes open. The view was a little wavy from the tears still in his eyes, but he saw the kid who was being beaten up before. His straight black hair was a wild mess, some bruises and dried blood spread across his face, a large flow coming from his crooked nose. The kid's wide eyes looked worried as he rubbed his lips together. Izuku slowly sat up with a sob as the movement jostled his arm. Thanks, the older kid blurted out. Izuku looked up at him with a confused face. For helping me out. He gave Izuku an awkward thumbs up. Real hero behavior. Really? Izuku warbled out as he sniffed. Really? The older kid nodded like an excited bobblehead. You probably shouldn't try to fight kids twice your size though. How old are you? 4. Oh, yikes, I'm 10. Really shouldn't be fighting kids over twice your age, the kid trailed off. Izuku. The boy scrunched up his nose, looking up at the other boy, and you are so old. Quote. Hey, I'm 10, not 30. The kid put a hand to his chest in mock offense. Wow, and here I was calling you a hero. All Might says heroics don't have an age limit. But heroes probably shouldn't be calling the people they save old. The kid squatted down and introduced himself with a smile. I'm Mako. Hi. The little green-haired boy suddenly was feeling a little shy. Hi yourself. You got a parent coming to pick you up. Izuku nodded. Good. You okay if I wait with you till they come? The little boy shrugged with one shoulder. All right. They fell into a slightly awkward silence. After a few beats, Izuku looked out of the corner of his eye at the older boy who was poking at the bridge of his nose. A confused face slowly grew as the boy poked harder and harder. Izuku was pretty sure it wasn't good to poke at a bleeding nose, but he wasn't going to tell Mako in case he was wrong. After a few more pokes, the older boy turned to the younger. Do you have a healing quirk? Izuku snapped his head to look at the boy with confusion. Mako laughed a little. I am gonna take that as a no. I don't have a quirk, not yet. Mako hummed, his eyes squinting down at the little boy. I think it might have just manifested then, little man. My face doesn't hurt at all anymore. Impressive. Mako nodded and gave Izuku a wink. You think that's my quirk? Healing. Mako shrugged, a crooked grin spreading across his face. He lifted his foot up and wiggled the toe of his bright red sneakers. I got extra joints in my toe, so it ain't mine, bud. But I think that is your mom, so let's go talk to her about it. He gestured to Izuku's mom down the street, her bright green hair shining as she turned, looking around for Izuku in front of his daycare. Izuku nodded and stood, wincing as his arm throbbed. The two kids walked to the woman who looked like she was just starting to panic when she turned and spotted the two boys. Relief washed over her, before the tension returned triple as she spotted how ruffled the two kids were. She darted over to meet the boys, slamming down onto her knees in front of Izuku and clasped his shoulders. The tight grip made Izuku's arm burn and the little boy whimpered, which made Inko let go like Izuku was a hot pan. Baby, where's the pain? My arm and see chest. Izuku struggled to get the words out of his mouth through the lump in his throat. Inko turned to the older boy with a pointed look. I'm fine. Yeah, no. The blood all over your face is telling a different story. Try again. I'm telling the truth. Izuku here healed me all up. The kid leaned over to gently ruffle the boy's green curls. The boy leaned into the touch as he blinked the tears out of his eyes. Inko's face twisted in confusion, looking between the two. What? Izu doesn't have. Inko's eyes widened as she looked at her son. Baby, did your quirk manifest? Izuku shrugged. I didn't do anything, so I don't know. That is okay. Let's get you to the hospital and we'll get them to check for your quirk too. How does that sound? Inko pulled out her phone, starting to dial, and as she put it to her cheek she turned to the older boy. You are coming with us. If Izuku did use his quirk on you, we need to make sure there aren't any side effects. Mako nodded. When you are done, can I borrow your phone? I'll need to call my mom. I'll talk to her to explain. Inko nodded back before turning to start talking to the emergency responder on the other end of the line. Izuku tuned out the conversation as Mako squatted down to look Izuku in his watery green eyes. Thanks again, little hero. You saved me a third time. Izuku looked at the boy with confusion. What was the second? Mako held out a hand and started counting on his fingers. Well, first, you came and tackled my bullies. Then, you fixed up all my injuries. And finally you helped me from having to come up with a lie as to why I was late home with my mom. Izuku itched his cheek on his shoulder. Lying is bad. You shouldn't do it. You are so right, so there you go, you saved me a fourth time. He threw his arms up in the air excitedly. Izuku let out a little giggle. You are being silly. I sure am. What's the point if you aren't a little silly, ya know? Mako made a few funny faces at the boy, making him smile and laugh. Izuku was having a bad day, but even on the worst days sometimes someone is able to make it just a little lighter. After getting a yellow cast and a long barrage of tests, Izuku was now incredibly bored. Mako's mom had come to the hospital to pick him up after the elementary school boy was given a clear bill of health but not without a promise of the two boys setting up a playdate. Mako's mom cried when Izuku called the older boy like a cool older brother. Izuku thought it was really weird when Mako's mom blurted out that Mako had no quirk. Then it was even weirder that she had started sobbing when Inko had told the crying woman that Mako and herself were welcome in their home whenever. After some hugs things seemed to calm down and Izuku wanted to ask what was going on but she whispered that she'd explain later. Izuku was a big boy and could wait, even though he was really curious. The tests and the talking to the nice nurse about her cool glitter quirk kept him busy. But now that the tests are over and all the nurses are gone, there was nothing to do and the little boy was so bored. He wanted to know how much longer he would be stuck here waiting. Izuku slumped into his mom and heaved a large sigh. "Baby, I know you're bored but I can't make the doctors go any faster. So I would appreciate less sighing." "But Moon," Izuku flopped fully into his mom's lap. "I'm so boo red. Can't we play a game or something? I'm sure they'll be right back any second now. Hold out for just a bit longer, okay? But we've already been here forever. It's been maybe 20 minutes, I wouldn't call that forever. That's a whole episode of Almighty Heroes. That is forever. Why don't you tell me about the most recent episode? I think I missed it." And keep him entertained, it did. In no time at all Izuku's animated full-body retelling of the way All Might and Gang Orca took out the H2 ogres was interrupted by a frazzled-looking doctor coming into the room. His large rabbit ears were twitching as he quickly crossed the room to bow slightly at Inko and Izuku. "Apologies for the wait. I wanted to triple-check the tests before filling out the quirk registration paperwork." With that the doctor sat at the desk, placing a file in front of him on it. "Why did you need to check 3 times? That seems like overkill." Inko folded her arms in front of her. "Well," he looked a bit sheepish as he scratched behind one of his large ears. Izuku thought they looked very soft and wanted to touch them, but he knew it was rude to ask someone he just met. After a second the doctor dropped his hand to the file to open it up. Izuku's quirk is in what is called a protected class of quirks. So it is mandatory for double testing. The third was just for my own peace of mind. Izuku felt his mom tense at those words. He wasn't sure why because that sounded really cool. He had some special quirk that probably would make him an even better hero when he was older. What does that mean? How can a quirk be protected? After the introduction of the registry the prevalence of trafficking skyrocketed. I'm sure you've heard about that. Yeah, that's why my parents voted against the registry before I was born. They worried what might happen if there was a way to just search up every quirk. Well, more and more safeties have been added to the list. It has even gotten difficult for police and heroes to gain access to it without justification in specific cases. An addition was additional lockdowns on the files for those with quirks that hold a high risk of trafficking. Wouldn't that still make them targets? My son having a redacted quirk status might as well be a bright target on his back. Tell me honestly, is my son going to be a target for traffickers? Izuku felt his mom reach a hand to brush her fingers through his loose curls. She sounded stressed. He didn't really like that. "I don't think I explained well enough, apologies. He's not going to even be searchable on the online registry. Healing quirks are exclusively stored on paper copies. To the electronic lists that periodically get hacked he will be a complete ghost." Izuku perked up at that. "My quirk allows me to become a ghost. Like the pro-hero poltergeist." "No, not quite." The doctor smiled down at the excited boy, his ears twitching. "Your quirk actually is a very powerful healing quirk." Izuku gasped. "Like Recovery Girl, even better." Izuku frowned. There is no way he is cooler than Recovery Girl. She was the longest-running healing hero there has ever been, with more than 1 million rescues attributed to her, and she has helped during a few major epidemics, working long hours healing injuries to keep the doctors at hospitals able to focus on the ill. There is no way he could be better than her. First off, you don't have to do any of that gross kissing to heal people. Izuku turned to his mom, standing up on his chair to shake her shoulder. Mom, did you hear that? Did you hear that?" Izuku felt like he was buzzing. This was all so cool. His mom laughed lightly and pushed him on his head to get him to sit back down. Yes baby, I am right here, so I did here. It is very cool. Yep, the doctor nodded. All you have to do is have those injured in a specific area as you are, and if your activation requirement is fulfilled they'll be as good as new. As you age there is a high chance the area will grow. Right now as long as someone is within just over a meter to you they'll heal. What is the activation? Is it talking? I know lots of quirks. Have you talked to activate it? Can I do it now? Your healing probably is already active with your arm being broken. What? Izuku's mom sounded upset again. He looked up from his yellow cast and up at the adults who were giving each other weird looks. Izuku was a bit confused. To activate his healing, little Izuku here needs to, the doctor swallowed, needs to be in pain or injured in some way. The speed of the healing is likely proportional to the damage to his body. Izuku watched as his mom's eyes filled with tears. He started sniffing as his eyes filled too. He leaned into her side and she reached around to squeeze his shoulders into her more. That is why his paper trail is being protected and hidden. Lots of bad people would be desperate for a quirk like this. There is no off switch for his healing. If he is in pain and close enough people will heal regardless if he wants to or not. OGD. What am I going to do to protect him? Izuku's mom leaned forward, her hands catching her face. Green hair making a curtain in front of her head. Ms. Midoriya, the doctor leaned forward to push the file closer to the crying woman. I can't promise perfect safety, but this will not be information that just anyone would have access to. Additionally, there are ways to downplay the quirk. Minor healing quirks, while not as common as, let's say, fire quirks, are just as protected as major healing quirks but are not as sought after. It would be fairly simple to underexpress how capable Izuku is to others. Even easier if he is kept away from those who are suffering from major injuries and that he is able to avoid major injuries himself. It can be played off as just a simple, cuts and bruises cure. Just how powerful of a quirk is it? Inko looked out from under her green fringe, her green eyes just barely catching the light. How concerned should I be? The doctor opened the file, flipping pages before pointing at some chart. I have never seen Recovery Girl's quirk results personally, but if I was to guess they would be at least on par with what we see here. Given the correct activation, Izuku could heal broken bones in milliseconds. Again, this isn't the hardest activation to hide. Doctor, Izuku is a child. He is going to get cuts and scrapes. He broke his arm today. I can't just pull him out of preschool until his arm isn't broken. And I am not going to wrap my boy in bubble wrap and stick him in a closet for his whole life. I can't take his life away from him. I understand. I am not saying you need to lock him away or totally hide the quirk, just downplay it. Healing some bruises on the playground wouldn't catch much attention, especially if that is all that is believed he can do. Okay, alright. Inko finally straightened and smiled at the doctor, brushing her fingers through Izuku's wild curls once more. Thank you doctor, I do appreciate it. And apologies for freaking out, this is a lot to think about. Don't mention it, this is my job and it is not every day that I have these kinds of conversations, but this has been far from my first. But now to the more fun talks. The doctor clapped his hands and turned to the little boy who had started fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. We need to come up with a name for your quirk. Izuku was absolutely stoked. He'd been so excited to get to name his quirk for so long that now that the time had come, he felt a little nervous. He told the adults who offered to help him come up with ideas, which the little boy was very grateful for. After a small brainstorming session between the three, Izuku ended up choosing to call his quirk Sympathetic Healing. Izuku noticed that his mom wasn't overly excited by the name like he was, but he thought it fit. Well, he did once the nice doctor explained what sympathetic meant. After Izuku and his mom had gone home with a large packet about Izuku's quirk, Inko stopped her son from running off to his room. Izuku was a little confused at the very serious face that his mom had as she squatted down to look him in the eyes. Izuku, I need you to promise me something. Izuku nodded, while shuffling a little back and forth. You need to never tell anyone how much you can heal, okay? Cuts and bruises only. Can you do that for me, baby? Izuku nodded again, then turned to go to his room. He wanted to play with his action figures. "Okay Izu, what can your quirk heal?" "Cuts and bruises," he murmured. He didn't really understand why, but it seemed important to his mom that he say this. And the wide smile on his mom's face was worth the confusion at being told to lie. "Thank you. Now I think I promised a movie night what we watchin'." Action figures forgotten. Izuku jumped up and down as he screamed, "Almighty heroes, the edge of glory." Inko chucked as she ruffled Izuku's hair. "Why would we ever watch anything else? Go set up the couch for a cuddle party. I'll go get us some snacks." Izuku bounded off, forgetting the weird looks and strained conversation, excited to watch his favorite movie with his mom. Chapter text. Hawks was having a bad day. Most people would be after being smashed through not one, but 4 concrete walls. Since the introduction of quirks, the general human body on average is more durable. So 1 or 2 walls and Keigo could have limped away with some badly ruffled feathers and maybe a broken bone. But 4 walls and a villain that had a fireball quirk. He had no chance. Sure, Hawks might be jumping through the ranks as a new up-and-coming hero, but even he wouldn't be walking away from this one. Keigo, dazed, stared up at the bright blue sky above him. One fluffy white cloud looked a bit like a chicken drumstick. He was a bit hungry and turned his head to try to see if it was lunch break yet. The movement made the whole view smear as his stomach lurched as the world went tumbling sideways. Moving is a no-go. Good to know. Keigo mentally cursed. No moving meant no chicken for him. He'd been kind of excited to try out the new place he had spotted earlier on patrol before the whole big fight. Curse his bad luck. As the ringing in his ears faded, Hawks realized the sounds of the fight had ended at some point. The crashes and sounds of shattered glass had been replaced by the faint sound of voices. Voices that were calling his name. They were probably looking for him. Keigo opened his mouth to try to answer, but only a wet gurgle came out. He tried to cough and a small spray of red shot into the air for Keigo to see. Oh boy, that is not good. Hawks had no idea where he was or why exactly the people shouting couldn't find him, but he couldn't move out of fear of making everything worse. Unknown to popular belief, Keigo doesn't want to die. He is just a bit reckless because he wants others to live more than he doesn't want to die. It is a fairly simple concept if only his handler understood it. Because the man never seemed to be able to wrap his mind around it. Keigo was probably in for another long-winded lecture. He just hoped that they wouldn't throw in some of their more dramatic punishments. Those were never fun. The throbbing in his everything brought Keigo back to the problem at hand, being injured and probably lost to those searching for him. Ideally it is some heroes and some competent EMTs. And in a perfect world they would also have a bucket of fried chicken. The likelihood of it being this perfect world is basically zero, but a man could dream. Laying wherever he is just slowly breathing wouldn't catch the attention of those searching. He needed to do something to help them find him, but he refused to move or shout out or. Keigo felt the lightbulb flash and flicker on. His quirk. He could send off some of his feathers to dance around to try to get people's attention. Lucky for the injured hero, his left wing was spread out to the side, and he was able to identify 5 contour feathers from his mid-wing that would be good enough to send off on their new mission. Keigo closed his eyes to try to help him focus on controlling the feathers. Splitting his focus on even just the 5 feathers felt like an impossible task. Keigo would notice one feather dropping onto the rough ground and prompt it back into the air just as one of the other feathers would start to drop. He felt like he was juggling the feathers instead of truly controlling them. Which was incredibly frustrating, as he had trained extensively to be able to simultaneously control sound 100 of his feathers at a time. So 5 feathers shouldn't be giving him any trouble. But it was. He probably had some sort of head injury. A bad one. Yuppie. That is going to. Keigo tried to groan in frustration as 3 of his feathers hit the ground at the same time, only to choke on the blood that was slowly pooling in the back of his throat. After catching his breath, he felt something grab one of the feathers. The vibrations of voices around the now trapped feather was a sensory nightmare. Normally he would be able to understand the words, but not now. Not when just breathing as calmly as he could was leaving him feeling tired. Now with how much his vision was swimming. He maybe was more injured than he originally gave himself credit for, which Ed. but the vibrations and tight grip on the shaft of his feather add more. Keigo ignored the other feathers, letting them rest on the ground. Focusing, he wiggled the one feather out of the grip and away from the rough fingers. Guiding it, he had it move back to its home in his left mid-wing. Screw being saved, if they followed it cool, if not he couldn't be bothered to care anymore. He was about to work to get the other 4 missing feathers back to him when the wound of yelling started to surround him. Hawks. I found Hawks. Loud crunching footsteps got closer. Hawks. Can you open your eyes? Keigo opened his eyes. He had kind of forgotten he had closed them. The blue was partially covered with a smeared orange blob. Hands started pressing down on his stomach. Keigo hissed. I'm sure this hurts, but I need to slow the bleeding. All the colors disappeared from Keigo's view. The pressure on his stomach grew, forcing a pained gasp out of his mouth. Oh no, you don't. You gotta keep your eyes open, Mr. Hero. Keigo cursed the orange smear person. Some faint part of him knew they were correct, but he also was tired and seeing was just so nauseating. Everything was too much. As more people flooded into his view, there was more yelling and more hands and more pain. Keigo let out a long sigh and closed his eyes. The yelling got louder as he let himself slip away into the abyss. Keigo blinked awake and groaned as he was still very much in pain. He wanted opioids, please. It felt like every bone in his body was shattered and all his guts had been scooped out with an impressively dull spoon. Also, patches of his skin had to still be on fire. He'd been trained in emergency medicine and he was pretty sure that putting out any literal fires on your patient was close to step 1. If not the first step. So whoever around him must be terrible at their job just letting him roast while trapped to this gurney. The commission will make heads roll when they find out that their precious birdie was being mistreated. Only they were allowed to mistreat him and claim it as all just for training. Abusive possessive BRDS. Keigo blearily opened his eyes to try to gain his bearings. He was in some medical ward. The classic blank white walls, blinking equipment and burning scent of antiseptic really gave it away. There were also a few medical staff milling about, cleaning and bandaging his body. None of them seemed to be worried, which was weird. Especially since he still was in a ton of pain and felt wrong. He couldn't move even if he had wanted to. He could move his eyes, but anything else seemed to be out of his control. There was a tube shoved down his throat which was forcing his lungs to fill and empty in a slow rhythm. It was too slow. He tried to take over breathing only for the machine to shove more air into his lungs. It felt like he was being drowned, but the dizziness from actual drowning was absent. Because he wasn't actually being suffocated, it just felt like it. The mounting panic grew and grew until something started flashing out of the corner of his eye. It must have clued someone in as the medical personnel closest to him noticed and gave him a tight smile before turning to shout. Hawks is awake, we gotta put him under again. Whoa there, hold up. Keigo'd just woken up and he wanted to know what was happening. Thank you very much. He didn't want to go under again. He wanted someone to take this tube out of his mouth and to explain what exactly was going on. A nurse in dark blue scrubs half jogged into the room with a brown bottle. They stood next to his bed by the arm that had an IV already placed into the crook of his elbow. Keigo hadn't noticed the IV until right then. Hopefully that bottle from the nurse had some better freaking pain meds. Keigo was about to close his eyes when a tiny little kid heavily limped into the room to stand next to his bed. No one else in the room seemed to take note of the short green-haired child. Keigo made eye contact with the bright green sparkling eyes surrounded by the cutest smattering of freckles and half hidden under the curly green fringe flopped over the kid's forehead. The kid then gave the hero the brightest smile which put Keigo at ease. Only for that ease to evaporate into terror at the child's manic grin as he pulled out a fairly large tactical knife from his hoodie pocket. What the F? This had to be a hallucination. This cute freckled baby couldn't be some scary assassin sent to kill Hawks, right? Maybe the pain meds were playing with his mind. Yeah, that had to be it. There was no way that the cutest kiddo was about to kill him. He just had to stay calm and ride the horrible drug trip until he could mention to the doctors to add whatever drug this is to his "don't give this to me again" list. It wouldn't be the first medicine to be added to that list. Curse his avian Quirk messing with his biochemistry in some weird and unexpected ways. Keigo had almost calmed down from the sight of a probably fictitious child brandishing a large knife when the kid rolled up his sleeves and the manic glint in his green sparkling eyes mellowed to one of determination. "Don't worry, Mr. Hawks, sir. I'll get you fixed up in no time." Keigo didn't even have time to be confused before the tiny adorable child in front of him slashed his own arm repeatedly in quick succession. "Mayday, mayday. Doesn't matter if this is a hallucination, what the actual F?" This child was bleeding heavily onto the ground and all Keigo wanted to do was to dart forward and grab the knife to throw it away. Then wrap the bleeding arm tightly in his own hands to slow the splattering of warm blood from pooling on the tiled floors. And then probably wrap the kid in bubble wrap, too. But Keigo couldn't do AHT. All he could do was watch in horror as his frozen body forced him to watch this hellish nightmare. The kid winced at the gash before putting the bloody knife on the edge of his bed. Keigo tried to move his hand to try to take the weapon away, but his fingers barely even twitched under the thin blankets. Keigo almost missed the kid reaching into his hoodie pocket once again, but saw right as the kid held up what looked to be a salt shaker before taking off the top. The kid must have sensed his confusion as the bleeding child shot the hero a strained and wobbly smile. "It's okay. It has to hurt to heal. You'll be all better quickly. It's okay." Keigo once more watched in numb shock as the kid dumped the whole shaker of salt into the deep cuts. The kid fell over and slipped out of Keigo's view, but he could hear the muffled screams and of the child in obvious agony. He tried once more to move, to scream, to do anything to help the child in pain, but he couldn't do anything. And no one in the room was reacting to the kid beyond quiet hushes and grumbled comments about blood on the ground. Keigo had never felt like more of a failure than in that moment. The icy feeling of whatever drug they flushed into his IV finally hit his veins, and the heavy drugged sleep weighed down his thoughts and started to drag him under. Keigo fought it as long as he could. He didn't want these drugs anymore. The pain would be worth it if he could only help the kid still making keening noises below his bed. Keigo could imagine the twisted expression as the kid squirmed on the dirty floor bleeding out. He didn't care if the child was hallucinating or not. He didn't want to sleep comfortably as the kid was suffering. Not like Keigo could fight the drugs forever. Try as he might, his view faded to black and the pained whimpers were dampened by the swirling drugs warping his hearing. But before he fully fell into his drugged slumber, Keigo promised himself that he would find and save this little boy if it was the last thing he did. Keigo woke up once again, but this time he felt, well, he felt 100% normal. Not in the "I ache but I'm in the hospital and I should take what I can get" normal, but the fully normal. The "I got a good night's sleep and had a night off from patrolling" normal. Which wasn't actually normal for the young hero, but he felt good and wouldn't complain about that no matter how odd it was. Keigo didn't think that he had totally lost it and had dreamed up the whole smashed through multiple walls and was burned to a crisp thing. It was pretty fuzzy, but he was fairly certain that all happened. Keigo was also pretty sure that the green-haired knife salt kid was real and not some messed up hallucination, even though he has no real evidence to back it up. If later down the line he comes to find out that this all was just his brain misfiring, Hawks refused to look deeper into what knife kid could mean to his psyche. He knew that his childhood of lack thereof had messed him up. But he turned 19 soon and might just crack the top 10 this next ranking. Hawks couldn't have some psychotic break yet. He needed to be a hero. And taking time to fix and resolve some mental breakdown would ruin his ability to help people, which was literally his whole purpose in life. So the kid was real and he was going to do his job and save him. A doctor in dark blue scrubs, like every other medical personnel here, and a white lab coat walked into Keigo's plain white medical room. The doctor had long maroon hair and had a pair of matching maroon half-moon glasses. She smiled at Keigo as she crossed to stand by his bed. "Glad to see you awake, Hawks. You gave us quite a scare. What happened?" His voice sounded like he had gargled acid for days on end and was barely audible. Luckily it didn't really hurt, but he still winced at how bad it sounded. "Ah, I will go get you some water. I will be right back." The doctor darted out, and before Keigo had a chance to mentally wander off, she came back. In her hand was a cup of water with a straw. Keigo sat up and made grabby hands at the cup, letting his wings fluff up behind him. The doctor handed over the cup and Keigo chugged it. Don't make yourself sick. We did a lot of work to keep you alive and well. Let's not immediately throw it all away now, Keigo rolled his eyes. He couldn't care less, he was thirsty. What happened? Where am? The doctor cut him off. What do you remember? Keigo tensed and worked to keep his feathers from fluffing up. He felt like this was some sort of test. The doctor's eyes started to glow as the suddenly tense silence spread between them. Keigo needed to lie. Something instinctual in him screamed at him to not mention the little green boy. If that happened, Keigo knew it would end badly for the two of them. I think I went through one too many walls. Which is embarrassing. I think afterwards I used feathers to get help. I am not totally sure, it's all pretty fuzzy. I probably got a concussion, yeah. The faint glow faded from the doctor's eyes as she relaxed. Keigo let out a slow breath as he realized he must have passed the first obstacle. This doctor probably had some form of memory-altering quirk. Or Keigo is being paranoid. At this point it is probably a 50-50 on that front. Actually, you had a bad brain bleed along with another 5 or so career-ending injuries. And this is one of the Commission's experimental medical centers. We had to do one of our newer experimental treatments, and even that was a bit touch or go for a bit, but after some minor recalibration the method was successful in fully healing you. What even were all my injuries? I apologize, but that's classified. I shouldn't have told you about the brain bleed. She held up a hand to silence the hero. The method is in the very early stages of testing, and if it spread around what exactly it is capable of doing, there would be negative consequences. Keigo just nodded to that, biting his tongue. He could read between the lines. He would be the one to get punished if he told a single soul. The winged hero felt a heavy sinking weight settle in his gut. He knew that somehow his miracle cure came at the expense of the poor green-haired child. Keigo hoped the kid was okay. Good. Now Hawks, you've been given a clear bill of health. There is a shower and a change of clothes in the bathroom. A commission driver will wait outside your room to take you home. Thank you, doctor. He gave her a small bow without cutting eye contact. Keigo couldn't help but feel anxiety about showing his back and wings to her without supervision. She put him on edge for reasons that he couldn't put his finger on, and he was a paranoid road. The eye contact seemed to amuse her as she gave the bowing hero a small smirk as she looked down her nose at him. You're welcome, Hawks. She gave a very small bow before walking out of the room. Keigo watched the door as it slowly shut before he let himself collapse back onto the stiff medical bed with a groan. He had no idea how to start his search into the green boy, but he knew that this was important. He didn't want the commission to be in sole control over another child. Not again. But this facility was a special one. Probably because he was so injured. Not like he knew, but brain bleed feels intense, and his one wing he knew was very much crushed if his fuzzy memories are to be believed. But unless he tried to almost kill or cripple himself again, he doubted he would ever come back to this facility. And there is no way that they would let him just look out the window of the car as he left. The commission could be weirdly possessive of people knowing where their secret labs are. Keigo would know as he grew up in one. The hero threw an arm over his eyes and wiggled his wings out to keep from being trapped under his body. It also allowed his sensitive wings to be at least 10 times more aware of his surroundings. The almost sensory overload was better than the suffocating anxiety of having his wings be trapped under him. Keigo, however, was grateful for his trained hatred of trapped wings when he sensed the faint thump come from the ceiling. Internally he groaned. The commission genuinely couldn't sink any lower. They had sent some poor agent to spy on him from the ceiling. Which was in addition to the cameras and microphone Keigo had already clocked in the corners of the room. How sad. A physical spy on top of the electronic spying seemed like overkill to a pathetic degree. He sighed and peeked under his arm. Above him was the air vent to the room, and he sent the best glare he could to what poor junior agent they sent. His golden eyes met the shining green eyes. Hawks froze, looking at the wide green familiar eyes. There is no way that he had that good of luck. The commission wasn't dipping into wild surveillance overkill, but instead struggled to control a small child. Which was another thing Keigo kinda understood. He knew how to get away from his handlers if he needed space for a few hours. It always came with bad consequences, but he still did it. The kid was definitely breaking protocol to be spying on him from the vents. Keigo was a little proud and also embarrassed that he'd never thought about using the vents. In Keigo's defense, he probably wouldn't have fit well with his wings. It was probably totally idiotic for the kid to be up there, but Keigo had never been happier at the audacity of a child. Not wanting the actual surveillance to catch on to the child's rule breaking, the hero stood quickly and made a dramatic show of exploding his flight and contour feathers off his back, straining to control each of them into a chaotic whirlwind around the whole room. He slipped one of the smaller feathers up into the vent to poke the kid's nose. The child squeaked a little but quieted and froze when the feather shifted to press against his lips to shush him. Keigo then moved the rest of the feathers to lay on the bed in a pile. He picked up one of the longer flight feathers with a grimace. The barbs were a chaotic mess and grime and dirt were caked into the small divot in the shaft. All his feathers needed to be deep cleaned and the preening was going to take hours, if not a whole day. But there wasn't much he could do about it here. He needed the various small brushes and products at his apartment. Knowing the commission, having shampoo and conditioner would be a large ask, Keigo was likely going to walk into the utilitarian shower and there be nothing more than a simple bar of soap. Keigo was vain, but could go one shower using bar soap in his hair and skipping the conditioning, but he refused having the cakey feeling of using bar soap on his feathers. He just wouldn't do it. Getting into the very small commission showers was always a little awkward. Even with all but his down feathers off, his wings made them smaller but not by a ton. So it was a cramped fit and trying to avoid his down getting too wet was always a challenge. As he rinsed off the last of the bar soap out of his hair, Keigo had called it, he felt the kid skitter away with his feather down the vents. His feather was gripped in his small hand, but he was pleasantly surprised that the kid was so gentle with it. Keigo finished drying himself off and got dressed as he focused on that feather as it traveled and finally stopped, wherever it was. About 35 meters southeast of where he was. Probably the kid's room, as the kid had dropped down with the feather placed between his lips. Keigo bundled up his dirty feathers into the sheet on the bed, shoving the whole package under his arm, and walked out the door of his room to nod to the commission driver. Hawks worked to fight a grin as he got into the back of the car and was asked to put on a blindfold, one feather lighter than he had been coming into the facility. As the car started and pulled out, he felt the homing of that last feather. He would be able to track it back no matter how far until the new pin feather grew back in after a 24 hours of it not being returned. He'd be able to track the kid for just under 3 weeks or so. He bit back a giggle as the kid started to chase the feather around, obviously having fun playing tag with Keigo from a distance. Finally Hawks was returned to his apartment, knowing that the driver drove in circles making sure that the time and the distance didn't line up at all. But knowing it would take Keigo no more than a 15-minute flight at his top speed to get to the facility was annoying since they had driven for 3 hours. Keigo was paranoid, but he'd gotten it from the masters, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in this case. Once Keigo entered his apartment, he threw his bundle of feathers into the bathroom counter and turned on the large bath to fill with warm water. He then went through the whole apartment and did a once-over for new microphones and cameras that he needed to discard or hack. He found 2 mics and 3 cameras, which was a pretty weak showing for them, so they must not be too concerned, which is a good sign. Returning to the bathroom, he rolled up his sleeves and moved the feather oils to be next to the filled tub. He then grabbed the feathers to put next to the stool he sat on by the tub. Keigo then picked up one of his main flight feathers and dipped it into the warm water and started gently massaging the grime off of it. About 60 kilometers to the southwest, Keigo felt a rhythmic tapping start to be pressed into the feather's shaft. It was some slightly stilted Morse code, but it made the man break out into a grin. Keigo split his focus between cleaning the feather in his hands and the tapping. "Hi Hawks, I am Izuku. Smart kid." Keigo was impressed as the kid then let the feather rest in his flat palm, obviously awaiting a reply. Not wanting to let the kid down, he shifted the feather to tap back. "Hi Izuku, call me Keigo, I'm here to help." For the first time in his life, Keigo felt like a real hero, not just some commission goon. Hawks knew he needed to treat this situation with caution. He didn't know exactly what was going on, so what he needed was information. Lucky for him, the green-haired child Izuku had that in spades, and was more than willing to talk to Keigo, which was a bit alarming how quickly he latched onto Keigo. It showed that the kid was starved for attention. Over the next few days Hawks was inundated with anecdotes and stories from the boy's childhood, learned the entire plot and deep lore of some TV show the hero had never really heard of, and also most importantly some hints as to why the boy was trapped in some commission facility. The kid was pretty tight-lipped about his current life, and whenever Keigo did poke at that the kid gave short responses that sounded tinged with sadness. Hawks could relate. He also didn't like talking about parts of his life for a bunch of different reasons, but he'd been trying to give the kid who was 11. Keigo found out more information as Izuku was a huge hero nerd and, in his words, wanted to know more about the first hero who broke the top 10 by 18. Which was very cute but also a bit awkward, as Keigo always had a small wiggling thought in the back of his mind questioning how much of his rank was him and how much was actually the commission altering his metrics to place their little winged pawn into a place of power. He'd probably never know, which Keigo didn't know how to feel about. But finally, after 3 whole days of chatting with Izuku, the hero got up the nerve to ask Izuku for his full name. The kid took some reassurance and was wildly reluctant, claiming that he'd been told not to mention his family name to anyone and could get in huge trouble for talking to Hawks and sharing his given name. The boy broke protocol by talking to him, but by giving him anything but his alias, Panacea. Izuku had told him this could get him in a lot of trouble and could put people at risk again. Keigo hated all of that, but even more he hated how much he understood the boy's nerves. He hadn't told anyone his family name since before he was taken in by the HPSC, and Izuku was the first person he told his given name to in years. Through gritted teeth and some anxiety he told the kid his full name and his actual birth date, not the one listed on all his commission-made socials, as a show of faith. The pause of any type of communication was too long and too stressful for Keigo. He sat on the couch preening his feathers on his wings in an attempt to self-soothe for a few solid minutes before the kid slowly tapped out his full name. Keigo wouldn't even deny the loud snort he made when the kid told him that his family name was Midoriya. It'd be like Keigo being named Macredwing, as his wings are the most prominent trait. He couldn't help himself and teased the kid for being so cagey for such an obvious option. Izuku was flustered if the wildly waving feather was anything to go by. Imagining the kid blushing and sputtering made Keigo chuckle even more. Once Izuku calmed enough to respond, it was the kid's self-assigned bedtime. He told Keigo he needed to sleep a little earlier as the next day was a big day for him and he needed as much rest as he could get. Keigo hated not knowing what that could possibly mean. His horrible imagination was running wild and he couldn't ask to assuage his nerves because the kid wouldn't even tell his full name without lots of prompting. The kid would freak out if Keigo kept probing, and he needed to make sure the kid was okay, and cutting off communication would be worse. So instead of doing what he wanted and begging the kid to let the hero bust in and fly him far, far away from the commission, Keigo wished Izuku sweet dreams and told him he hoped tomorrow went smoothly for him. He also asked the kid to reach out once his big day was over. With a quick, "will do," Izuku stashed the feather wherever he always did when not actively chatting with the hero. The constant muffled pressure flattening the feather was pushed to the back of Keigo's mind. Practically flying, Keigo sprung off his couch to scramble to his hidden laptop. There was a chance that the commission had found this one and wiretapped it, but he had hidden it behind a false panel under his kitchen sink. And the specific bottles he'd placed as a signal of tampering had not been obviously altered. Getting information on Izuku was worth the risk. Booting up the laptop was taking forever and Keigo couldn't help but drum his talons along the edge of the laptop. He couldn't bring himself to even move out of the awkward crouching position in the middle of his kitchen floor. He needed to get the info on the kid now. Later he could bring on other heroes and make plans. Maybe other heroes. He wasn't totally sold on the idea, as he was never totally sure who was in the commission's pockets and who wasn't. But depending on what he finds, he might need more help figuring out who will be a bridge he crosses when he gets there. Finally the laptop logged on and Hawks rolled his shoulders back and got to work. Thank goodness for poor Ms. Joke, and the hero license Hawks swiped off of her at a gala a few months back. He felt a little bad when he heard secondhand how she'd ended up in a lockup for a few hours on vigilante charges. She had swapped patrols with some underground hero and the police didn't recognize the Twilight hero as she was from a few cities over. Keigo couldn't be mad at the police. It is unreasonable to know all the heroes in Japan. And Ms. Joke seemed to have a good sense of humor about things, so she probably laughed it off. But Keigo still felt a little guilty about it. Using her ID number, it wasn't too hard to crack into the hero net under her username, which is a little concerning, but it worked in Keigo's favor. But once logged in, Hawks started a search in the police database regarding one Midoriya Izuku. There were a handful of different records and reports on file. Starting with the oldest, the hero started reading. Reading the first report made Keigo laugh. He wished he was surprised, but honestly it was in character. The report detailed the kid being caught up in a villain attack and being used as one of a handful of hostages 2.5 years ago, when the kid was only 9, poor kid. He got caught because he forgot to run because Miriko is just that cool. Lucky for the kid, he only had minor injuries and every other hostage ended up being totally fine. Izuku had been left off with a reminder that the best thing that a civilian can do to help the pro heroes is to get out of the way. Keigo sighed, thinking of all the people who'd not followed that advice even in his short career. So many people ended up becoming a major nuisance, or worse, injured or dead, because they were fangirling or trying to assist in some way. Bless civilians, but they are dumb 95% of the time. Feeling a little reassured, Keigo opened the next report. Only filed a month or so later. Izuku and some older boy named Onishi Mako were brought into the police by an off-duty sidekick. The hero had seen the two boys beating up 2 other kids. Keigo frowned at the way the report stated that the Onishi kid was a bad influence on the younger boy and how he couldn't help being a troublemaker given what they are, but pulling the bright young Midoriya was despicable. Keigo really hated how that all sounded. If it looked like discrimination, and it sounded like discrimination, it was probably discrimination. The Onishi kid probably had some mutation or villainous quirk. From the few days Keigo had been chatting with the boy, the hero had gotten the overall feeling that the kid wouldn't go around beating up kids for fun. Or even get pressured into it from a friend. He would, however, do it if he felt it was justified. And kids bullying a friend. The exact type of justification that a big hero nerd like Izuku would consider worth the possibility of getting in trouble. The next 2 reports solidified the bullying theory. Over that year the kid had gone to the precinct 2 separate times with photo evidence, and video evidence the second time, of quirk discrimination at the local middle school. A few of the adults had been complicit and egged the other teens to harass each other. The first report seemed half-hearted and the only follow-up was just a brief email to the school, which the school's response either never happened or was never recorded. The second report must have gotten to someone who was less incompetent or less quirkist, and a few convictions were made of the teachers and disciplinary actions were set against some of the students. Keigo was impressed Izuku's evidence was actually legally acquired and was able to be used in court to help prove the various crimes. Specifically against Onishi's homeroom teacher, who had been restricting his student from eating his lunch daily for weeks on end and assigning borderline dangerous tasks to the student. The teacher ended up in prison for multiple counts of quirk discrimination and child abuse. It took a lot of guts and smarts for a 9-ish-year-old kid to do all the research to know how to legally obtain evidence like that, and then follow through to collect it twice. Color Keigo impressed. If the kid is at all interested in being a hero still after being freed from the HPSC, Hawks would take the kid under his wing, ha pun totally intended, and do nothing but sing his praises. Moving on to the next few reports put a bad taste in his mouth. They were all reports of possible stalking of Izuku, all reported by one Midoriya Inko, a name the hero jotted down for reference. It had to be the mom. The first in a series was from just over a year ago. The first 2 were spaced by 2 weeks. Then the third 3 days after. Then there were 2 reposts back to back demanding the police to do something. An overview document mentioned increases of paranoia of the woman and how she was totally convinced that the people following her son were from the government and that the government wanted to take her son away, even with a lack of viable evidence. Keigo pursed his lips as he read about how the police had sent a social worker to do a wellness check on the child after the first 2 paranoid calls and Izuku being pulled from school. The report stated that there were no signs of abuse or neglect and ended with a follow-up meeting being set and that the social worker had shared mental health resources with Ms. Midoriya. Keigo didn't like where he was pretty sure where this story led, but he needed to finish reading the last few reports. As expected, it was as bad as he'd thought. According to the reports, a salesman had knocked on the paranoid Midoriya door and the woman snapped and assaulted the man with her quirk, pulling his eyes out of his skull. Holy S. And EU. Double EU. It took a second for Keigo to get back on track from learning that the woman who made the best katsudon, and gave the biggest warmest hugs, also ripped some man's eyes out. Shaking himself, smoothing down his ruffled feathers, he focused back on the reports. The man had fought back with his quirk leading to a fire. In the chaos, Inko had run off with Izuku. There had been a manhunt for the two once the eyeless man was found after the neighbors called about the noise and smoke. The hunt only lasted just shy of 24 hours, when Midoriya Inko was found walking aimlessly down a boardwalk near a beach in Mustafu. She was covered in dried blood from herself, the salesman and her son. Izuku was not found with her, and when asked she broke down crying, and efforts to calm her down ended with her lashing out. She had testified later that there had been more people with the salesman who had taken her son before the fire had started, and it was only when she realized her son was taken that she took the man's eyes out and ran to try to follow the group of kidnappers. After some time she had lost the trail. The detectives with minimal evidence believed that it was possible that Izuku was killed by Inko and hid at the beach, which was a fairly common dumping ground for both trash and bodies. They believed it was possible that to protect herself from the reality, her mind had concocted this larger plot and refused to acknowledge the truth. The evidence they used was the history of paranoid calls. The file had multiple testimonials from therapists that all stated the woman showed signs of possible paranoid and high levels of agitation, but it was not apparent if her story was delusions, was caused by some illusion quirk, or was just an outright lie. With the apartment being mostly ash, there was practically no evidence to help balance the he said she said of what happened that night. Midoriya Inko ended up being sentenced to 15 years in a prison made for the purpose of housing those with mental illnesses, focused on rehabilitation and providing mental health care to the criminals. She had no possibility of parole until the end of those 15 years, and only on the decision of the doctors on site. She'd been lucky and dodged the homicide charge from a lack of evidence, but even just the charge of second-degree aggravated assault using a quirk was not something that someone would want on their records. There was a footnote that mentioned that she could have taken a plea deal but refused. She stuck to her story of self-defense, which helped convince the judge to specifically send her to the facility they did. The judge recorded that there was enough evidence for them to believe that Ms. Midoriya was suffering from delusions and paranoia and needed help to re-enter society. Keigo had seen the evidence and felt that was a bit harsh and unfounded, but he was a hero, not a judge or lawyer. Also, Hawks was biased, and probably would be deemed paranoid to go to a similar facility if he was ever convicted of a crime. He actually believed her story more. Firstly, because Keigo had seen the missing kid with his own two eyes, and he was very much not murdered by his apparently paranoid, delusional mother. Secondly, this is the exact type of nonsense the commission would pull if they needed a quirk badly enough. And Keigo had yet for any of these files to include the kid's quirk status, meaning he was a protected quirk holder. And from first-hand experience, the kid had to have a healing quirk, and a powerful one at that. So of course the HPSC wanted him. Third, the kid's abduction lined up concerningly close to when All Might suddenly went overseas for a long-term mission, which Keigo knew to be ultimate hogwash. He had been a bored 17-year-old at the time and was big on eavesdropping on various agents. A whole group of the more yappy agents were cursing the number one hero for causing so much extra work for them, talking about how the false media reports would be for who knew how long, as All Might had been almost dead injured. Keigo had none of the specifics, but it lined up, and since the hero was able to bounce back as quickly as he did, implied the possible use of the kid's quirk. He had none of the specifics, but the commission had probably been following the poor kid for a while. Probably was flagged for observation by his impressive takedown of the quirkist teachers. They might have even approached the family in person to offer a similar program as Keigo's mom had. But Ms. Midoriya obviously said no to selling her child to the government, where his mom had said yes. Jealous, but glad the kid had a good mom. The commission probably backed off a bit, just watching, until the need was great enough. The sloppy work from whoever tailed them ended up working in the HPSC's favor, as they could use Inko's reports to paint a picture of a paranoid woman and then kidnap the kid right in front of her. The kid was also declared, assumed dead, much too soon after being flagged as missing. His body wouldn't have been half decomposed. However, once a missing person was officially missing but assumed dead, their photos were no longer actively sent to all the local hero agencies. The commission probably wanted less people to have memories of the kid if they planned to train him to be a hero like Hawks. They'd scrubbed his record, which looked suspicious as heck. This story, however, was the perfect abduction and death story. Someone at the HPSC was probably patting themselves on the back for such a smooth and perfectly wrapped abduction. They could reintroduce the kid after half a decade with a hero alias and a masked hood, and even friends would likely never realize it was the missing boy. It did make Keigo wonder what Izuku's side of the story was. What story had they sold the kid, because there was no way it was the same story as the outside world was sold. The sweet and caring mom in all of Izuku's childhood stories never could be twisted into some villain for the kid. If Keigo was to hazard a guess, they'd probably told him that she had died a hero trying to save him from the first set of kidnappers. Then had an agent act as a lesser-known hero to save him. Keeping him there would be difficult, but they might have been able to convince a 10-year-old boy that he was in some weird witness protection. Or just told the hero fanboy that All Might needed his quirk and jumped at the opportunity. Keigo would love to ask, but if getting the kid's full name was a challenge, there was no way he'd answer this. For such a chatty kid, he was surprisingly tight-lipped. It was both a very fun and infuriating challenge. Keigo closed the laptop and closed his eyes. The imprint of the boy's death certificate was burned into his retinas, and he could still see it in the back of his eyelids. He stretched his wings out to the sides and leaned back to rest his head on the side of his kitchen island. Keigo let out a long sigh. He needed other heroes for this. Heroes who'd believe him. Heroes that would be okay going up against the commission and possibly going borderline vigilante and breaking the law. Heroes that were able to go under the radar to collect the evidence they needed. Heroes like. Keigo sat up, slapping his hands on the floor to launch himself up with his wings, flapping them to maintain the smallest shred of balance. The wind he created was enough to knock over his trash can. The young hero ignored the empty takeout containers that now spread across the tiled floor. Keigo darted to his room, quickly checking his phone clock to check the time. It was just after midnight, which was perfect. Throwing on some dark maroon joggers and slipping on a fleece-lined black tank top and a thin black athletic windbreaker with wing holes, Keigo held back some inhuman screeches. He wanted to, but the natural raptor calls had been beaten out of him, so he was able to hold himself back. Blinking, he turned to look at himself in the mirror. He scowled. The very obvious huge bright red beacon sprouting off his back screamed, "I'm Hawks." Quote. Even trying to be understated, he'd stick out like a sore thumb. Yanking on a dark blue winter hat, which did nothing to really hide his identity, he decided that there wasn't much that he could do on such short notice to hide his identity. At least he wasn't in his hero suit and his blonde hair was covered. Maybe people would think that he was just some other winged individual going for a midnight flight. He sighed as he slipped his trainers on his feet. He had no doubt that if anyone who followed his career saw him, they would immediately clock him as Hawks. Maybe there is a way he could use that to his advantage. Nodding to himself slowly, he slid his balcony door open, stepping out into the crisp midnight air. He could use his very identifiably feathers to his advantage here. Honestly, it would probably make the whole interaction smoother. Keigo climbed up on the railing of his balcony before falling backwards over the edge. His wings pressed tight to his back to help him gain speed before snapping them open as he twisted midair, heading toward Mustafu. Everyone knows that unders are unlikely to just follow any random buy to a secondary secure location. That's how heroes disappear or die. And Eraserhead has been in the game long enough to know how to not just survive in the most dangerous hero field, but how to thrive in the underground. Chapter text. Aizawa Shota was having a bad day. He'd been woken up by Hisashi much too early, especially for only getting a measly 3 hours of sleep. His stomach was a little queasy from the lack of sleep, making his large cup of mandatory morning coffee sit very wrong in his gut. But there was nothing he could do about it, unless people wanted him to commit murder if he was to forego the cup. His homeroom class this year held potential. Only a handful had needed a reality check, but with the nature of teenagers some days being a teacher is more akin to herding cats. And today the class was being rowdy. A few notes were passed, loud giggling, some singing paired with some weird series of dances. The teenage shenanigans ramped up, ending with a more volatile quirk being activated, accidentally melting a desk and leaving a slight dip in the floor. Shota is a strict teacher on a good day, but he does realize that he'd given the students free time to work on their essay for his laws and ethics class. And that specific student had worked hard to rein in their quirk and had been doing very well the past month or so. The rational part of Shota knew that it was an accident and the levels of rowdiness wasn't generally obscene, and was probably a good thing for the high-strung hero course students to let loose and be children from time to time. However, it was not a perfectly rational Aizawa sensei that tackled the event. No, it was the very nauseous, grumpy and exhausted Eraserhead that responded. He had given the whole class detention for letting things get out of hand and chewed them out before forcing the class to sit in silence for the rest of the period. Giving a class of 17 students detention for 3 days for acting like 15-year-olds when they are 15 was probably an abuse of Shota's power as a teacher. He would have to apologize to Yamamoto. It wasn't her fault that her highly destructive quirk was caused by laughter. He also needed to make it up to the class. Maybe he would make their detention something relatively enjoyable. Maijima had his third-year class design new obstacle courses for an assignment that needed test subjects. The support classes also were always in need of people to test their gear too. Shota made a mental note to email Majima to make sure he has some things for his class to do the next day. One positive from his day was that he had been able to finish all his grading at lightning speed, mainly because he didn't assign anything new and the last few days had been discussions on various practical situations regarding topics Shota had lectured on the week prior. Putting in participation points to the grade book took no time at all, so he was able to sneak in a full 2-hour nap. One solid negative was that nap was rudely ended by Nimari tripping over him. She'd kept from fully crashing to the floor by doing some very complicated footwork, but in doing so she ended up taking her very sharp heel and stepping onto, and a little bit into, Shota's shoulder and kicked him in the face. Nimari had apologized repeatedly and had personally carted him to Recovery Girl, while his fiancé had to sit down because he was laughing too hard. The traitor. After the embarrassment of being thrown over Nimari's shoulder like a sack of rice, Shota hadn't thought it could get worse until Recovery Girl herself refused to heal him. She went on and on about how his stamina levels were concerningly low and that if she'd tried there was a non-zero chance he'd ended up in a 24 to 48-hour coma. Saying that sounded like a good vacation and saying to bring it on was apparently the wrong move. As the elderly healer had just gone back into another tirade about how he needed to take care of himself to be an example to his students if not for the people who cared for him. Nimari was smart and had slid out of the room as soon as the woman started ripping into Shota the first time. When Recovery Girl got into angry healer lecture mode, no one was safe. Having his whole medical history thrown in his face wasn't pleasant, from the absolutely obsessive training he did at UA after Oboro died to his refusal to seek medical after fights and almost bled out a handful of times to his smoking and coffee drinking habits. She also seemed actively affronted by his work schedule and how even on the best days he'd never be able to have a consecutive 5 hours of sleep between his time teaching and then the late night shifts he pulled as an underground hero. And his schedule frequently caused him to skip meals and use meal replacement jelly pouches, sometimes for days on end. It was like every aspect of his life gave the woman heartburn or something. Apparently the woman was concerned. But the long-winded lecture finally led up with a guilt-inducing plea for the man to take better care of himself, even if it was just one thing. Shota couldn't spit in her face and fully ignore her, so told her he'd work towards cutting back on the smoking. Which was something he'd wanted to work on for years, but just hadn't made a lot of progress on. There were always higher priorities. Apparently this was the correct thing to say as the elderly woman relaxed and switched from angry lecture mode to genuine advice and offers for assistance and a box of nicotine patches. Shota was grateful for the options and promised to check in with how it was going, but it meant that he didn't have time to go home before he started his shift. He almost reached for the jelly pouch before the echoing voice of Recovery Girl chimed in his mind, and the tired hero sighed and headed to his favorite udon place, getting a real meal, for once. Only for the place to be closed unexpectedly. Which was fine, but he was now really craving udon, so he had to go 8 blocks out of the way to go to the second best udon place in the area. The cashier was also chatty and wouldn't let Shota take his udon in silence. Extroverts were the worst. The too long conversation left him having to eat his udon quickly. He burnt tongue. It wasn't the end of the world, but it was just one more little thing to add to a less than stellar day. Jogging lightly to get to his shift on the surveillance case on time, Shota started feeling nauseous again as the broth he'd just downed sloshed around. This is why jelly meals were superior to regular meals, but he wouldn't be caught dead saying that in front of Recovery Girl. The mid-evening was wildly boring as the case subject, who normally went and did things both legal and illegal, decided today was the best day for a day in. The suspect was likely a higher up in a Quirk trafficking ring, and they had yet to get any hard evidence for it. Shota understood this sort of thing took time, but sitting on a roof, listening in on bugs they'd place and periodically checking that the man was still watching some inane TV show through his high-rise apartment window was boring. And Shota would be fine with boring normally, but he had to constantly fight his body's valiant efforts to force him to sleep. It was a little alarming how hard it was to stay awake. He used to be able to go for 3 or 4 days on maybe an hour and be fine. Today he'd had 5 hours, and even with multiple cups of coffee he was on the edge of passing out the moment he was still for longer than 30 seconds. Maybe Recovery Girl had a point that he needed to take better care of himself. But maybe Shota didn't care. Burning the candle at both ends gives the world more light. He was a hero. He was expected to give his all and then some to benefit those around him. Maybe he did care. Maybe the man was sick of being exhausted constantly. Maybe he wanted to be a bit selfish. Maybe he wanted to curl up next to his fiance and just peacefully sleep. Maybe he wanted to not feel out of breath and shaky at the end of a shift. Maybe if he was better he wouldn't lash out at his students the way he had today. Finally, after what had felt like forever, Clover, the under who was scheduled to take over the surveillance after Shota, arrived. Giving a half-hearted salute, he jumped off the roof using his capture weapon to swing down to the alley. The adrenaline of the controlled fall helped wake him up, and he was off to do his active patrol. No longer on the verge of falling asleep, Shota jumped from roof to roof, stopping petty crime, and he even walked a few drunk young adults home after they got lost and turned around. It was fairly routine and made the underground hero smile. It had been the first thing in his off day that had finally felt normal and actually good. That was until a large feather streaked into his peripheral vision. Eraserhead twisted around, searching for the possible owner of the feather. Seeing no one, he creeped closer to the feather that was floating mid-air. The very bright red feather. Internally, Shota groaned. Even with all his efforts to actively ignore all daylight heroes, barring Present Mike and some of his UA coworkers, Shota knew of Hawks, the new hero who had been taking the charts by storm and breaking records left and right. One of his students this year could fly, and she obsessively followed his short career. She was also very loud about her fangirling that even with all his efforts to tune it out, he still picked up on most of it. However, knowing that Hawks has dreamy eyes and hair that begs to be ruffled, according to a 15-year-old, gave Shota little to work with. To add to the fangirled rambled numbers and anecdotes from his socials, there were also whispered rumors about the young hero. About how naturally talented Hawks was. How even the best trained heroes from the various schools couldn't even begin to match his ingrained reflexes. How the teen, while flashy and personable, never talked of his past in interviews. How no hero school claimed him as his alma mater. How his medical care was always handled in-house at HPSC facilities. Shota knew that unders could be huge gossips, especially if it is at the possible expense of a flashy daylight hero, but he couldn't deny that he'd gone and searched up and watched a few videos where Hawks behaved more like a lifelong under who had been pushed into the spotlight as opposed to the new hero he is. Checking exits, never relaxing, keeping everyone in his sightline were just a few of the concerning behaviors. Shota would bet money that Hawks was some creation of a shady organization within the HPSC. Shota couldn't help but wonder if his pushback and refusal to work with the HPSC was finally coming back to bite him. Unders went mysteriously missing semi-regularly after speaking up against some of the shady BS the HPSC pulls. This might be his time, and his curiosity of what happened to them might finally be satiated. Eraserhead, now on full alert, reached out a hand to grab the feather that had just been lazily twisting in a circle. Just as his calloused fingers brushed the red feather, it moved out of reach. He sighed, and reached again, only for the feather to once again slip out of his grasp. This repeated a few times before the feather twisted into an ornate pirouette before gesturing for the hero to follow. Eraserhead looked at the neighboring roofs once more, before mentally slapping himself. This was Hawks, the hero known for his ability to fly. He looked up. Shota saw a fast circling shadow at least 100 meters into the night sky. He watched as the shadowy blob flew across the sky before dipping down more than a few kilometers away. The feather wiggled again, trying to get Shota to follow it in the same direction Hawks had landed. The underground hero sighed, before following the blasted thing. Something told him that his long tiring day was just about to get a whole lot longer. "You're so slow." The words rang out from above in the vast void of the unlit scaffolding. The voice was a touch whiny, similar to some of the students he'd taught, and it set Shota's teeth on edge. "Some of us are not blessed with quirks that help with mobility. Be glad I came at all." Shota walked to the middle of the abandoned warehouse, his hands dug deeply into his pockets as he slouched in his faux relaxed posture. He hoped that Hawks was like other idiotic daylight heroes and wouldn't pick up on the tension in his shoulders, nor the loose loop of his capture weapon easily accessible. The winged hero fell from the inky blackness that was the unlit ceiling to drop in front of Shota. Gold eyes flickered as they raked up and down the underground hero. A small smirk tilted his mouth as the young hero mimicked the tired hero's posture to a T. Shota did everything in his power to not react, but he was equal parts enerved and impressed. It was rare for a daylight hero to clock the readiness Eraserhead was always at, let alone be able to mimic it flawlessly in less than 5 seconds. Or if Shota was being more honest, less than 2. The curling concern wrapped itself around Shota's gut. He didn't want to read too much into what it could mean for this barely 19-year-old to have skills he doubted his fiance had after a decade of daylight hero work. The whispers and rumors overlapped each other in his mind, creating a symphony of chaos. The smirk grew into a full-on grin. Hawk's wings puffed up in the ways that the videos of excited cockatiels that he would send to Hizashi to make fun of him. They flapped a little, causing swirling eddies of dust to fill the warehouse. Shota thought it was cute, and then immediately pushed that thought down. "I knew I made the right choice. I can smell the protective instincts on you. You will be perfect." Quote. The man gestured to the hero before turning to grab at the papers rolled in his pocket. Hawks was focused on the papers and working to unravel them. Shota felt off-kilter by the whole interaction. "What does that mean? You like kids, yeah?" Shota felt his face twitch in confusion. The papers were held against his chest like they were something precious. The winged hero's gold eyes bored into him. The intense look made Shota feel a little self-conscious. No one ever looked that intensely at Eraserhead, not even his students during a lecture. "Is this some sort of test? If I say yes, will you answer honestly?" The intense look somehow increased by a factor of 10. The feathers along the edge of the hero's wings sharpened into a row of spikes. "I find kids infuriating and exhausting." Shota held eye contact with Hawks. Something told the underground hero that he needed a more honest answer, more than what he usually told people. "However, illogically, I cannot help but feel the need to protect and care for them. They are annoying but are learning to be people, so I can't fault them for it, and would be a bad hero if I didn't try to help guide and care for them when I can. I have temporarily fostered a few children as the remaining family members have been tracked down or long-term placements can be made. And I am sure you are aware I am a UA teacher." The sharp feathers loosened, practically vibrating as they lost their razor-like points. Shota was going to take that as him passing whatever test that had been thrown his way. He had no idea where this was going anymore and decided the best course of action was to collect more information. "Why do you want to know? One more question before I share more." Shota squinted but slowly nodded at the hero. Is the protection and safety of a child more important to you than following protocol? Oh, this was a test. This was something he would pose to his ethics class at UA as a hypothetical. However, there was no way that this was just a hypothetical. Hawks for some reason caught word about a child who was in danger, enough danger that he needed backup. Warning bells were screaming at Shota. Hawks was likely a HPSC agent in some way. He was too tightly connected with the organization to not be, and needed backup when normally the hero had the backing of the HPSC. An organization Shota was known to be critical of, or as critical as he could without suddenly retiring. The Hero Public Safety Commission had a child. One that Hawks clocked as needed saving. Those RDS. A fire was lit under Shota and he wanted nothing more than to storm into whatever building and steal back the child from whatever hell they had put them through. The familiar feeling of his hair raising up off his scalp startled him. It had been some time since he lost control of his quirk from emotions. He blinked, carefully keeping his face still to hide the embarrassment. From that reaction, I am now more curious about what you are about to say. The winged hero was still tightly wound, but the easygoing smile looked less plastic and the death grip on the papers had loosened. The safety of a child is more important than any protocol. The first thing I teach my students is, prioritize the rescue. If anything gets in the way of the safety of those we as heroes swear to protect, then the hero isn't doing their job. How about laws? The gold eyes were guarded as they searched Shota. What about them? Dark eyes returned the searching expression to the winged hero. Would you be willing to break laws to save a child? Yes. Shota didn't even have to think about it. He shrugged. It honestly wouldn't be my first time. And it really wasn't. He had broken multiple laws to protect kids he'd found on his patrols. He also had bent and twisted hero protocol too. And that wasn't counting the number of times the man had technically committed vigilantism his first year of UA before transferring into the hero course. He had been bitter and an idiotic teen. In the grand scheme of things, some counts of vigilantism wasn't the worst form of teen rebellion. Even if you could end up in Taurus. Hawks took a tentative step closer to Shota. Holy S. What did Hawks find? If the laws and protocol of the HPSC are so broken that they can endanger a child, I would gladly take the fall if the child is freed. Shota let his apathetic expression twist into the grin that made his students shudder. And I'd love to see them try. I wouldn't go down without a fight. Neither would Hizashi. Honestly, people were scared of Shota for radical thinking, believing that he was the unhinged one in their relationship. But those who truly knew the couple knew that Shota was actually the rational even keel to Hizashi's almost manic desire for violent chaos when prompted. Shota wasn't the only one breaking vigilante laws in high school. He just never got caught. Hawks didn't seem surprised that Shota had obviously put a few things together. He nodded and held out the papers. They were printouts of police reports and handwritten notes. A black and white picture of a grinning kid with the wildest plume of hair, no older than 9 or 10. There was a gap in his smile and his chubby freckled cheeks squished, his eyes almost closed with how wide the smile was. Shota skimmed the very brief overview on the kid. Midoriya Izuku. Male. Birth date July 15th. Doing some math, the kid was 11. Quirk status. P.O. HPSC was quirk trafficking. Or something too close to it. Protected quirk explained why the kid was targeted. Most protected quirks related to healing, teleportation, time travel, precognition or mind control. All things that criminal organizations paid high dollar for. And apparently the HPSC would also go for them too. He wished he was surprised, but this seemed almost logical from the things he did know about the organization. The next leap for Shota to lose whatever scraps of faith he had left in humanity. Shota quickly flipped through the other pages. A few police reports of bullying, stalking, violent disappearance. Looked like the mom was assumed to be at fault. Her questionable sentencing smelled fishy from the cursory look through. Reading it fully likely will bring more to light. He flicked his eyes up at the winged hero and raised one eyebrow. I doubt you would waste my time on a dead kid. Shota drawled. Izuku isn't dead. I talked to him earlier tonight. Finally got his full name and found about all this. Why does a high-ranked hero like you seek out an under like me for this? Why not reach out to some of your daylight buddies? Hawks looked down and away, chewing on his lower lip. A few feathers moved from the wings to twist and turn in the air around his hand. The young hero focused on the dancing feathers for a few moments before one landed in his hand. He started twisting it between his fingers. Shota couldn't help but be surprised by the show of vulnerability and anxiety. He didn't follow heroes religiously like some, but he'd never seen the young hero so blatantly stressed. Either this was weighing so heavily on his mind that his walls had come down, or Hawks had decided to show Shota more to help him realize how important this was. I was injured badly. I probably should have died or at least turned out crippled. Hawks frowned, dropping the feather, controlling it to join in with the other swirling feathers. But I was taken to a special HPSC facility. One I had never been to before. Hawks looked up from the feathers to look Shota in the eyes. The wide-eyed, stressed look made something in Shota's heart ache. Hawks was still technically a teenager, and in the moment the look in his gold eyes made him look like a child. The hero was not that much younger than his students in the grand scheme of things. That deep desire to protect pulled at Shota's chest. I was fairly out of it, so at first I thought that I was hallucinating. But I saw the green bean, Izuku, come into my room as they were about to put me back under. He then proceeded to cut open his own arm and rub salt into it. The feathers froze for a few breaths before they continued on their lazy loops. I've seen some s. He huffed a laugh, his wings rustling. Every hero has, but that was horrifying. I couldn't do anything. I just laid there as the drugs put me back under. A feather moved to do slow circles around Shota. He reached out a hand, palm up, as an invitation for it to land. The feather landed and he started to lightly fiddle with the feather. The young hero gave a small smile as he watched Shota ghost his fingers over the soft barbs of the feather. I woke up feeling totally healed about a day later. I was able to catch a glimpse of the kid in the air vents of all places. Slipped him a feather. Hawks scratched the back of his head. I have been ordered to keep the exact details of my quirk hidden, which most heroes do. It's safer that way, but I can do more than just control the movements of my feathers. I can actually sense touch, and if I have enough feathers in an area I can sense air vibrations and can do a form of surveillance. It isn't 100% accurate, similar to lip reading, but I've been trained and can fill in blanks fairly well. I wanted to be able to listen in, but figured hiding that number of feathers was asking a lot of a child. So he has one. Figured I could trace it back to him at a later date to get him out of there. A soft smile grew on Hawk's face. The kid is a huge hero nerd, and wanted to talk to me. I don't know how he knew my quirk details, but he tapped out Morse code onto the feather. We have been chatting back and forth. Shota nodded. What's the goal here? To get him out of there. Hawks looked at Shota like he had said the sky was bright orange. What do you think the goal was? A known HPSC-affiliated daylight hero comes to an underground hero known to be outspoken against practices of the HPSC with a request to not only go against the organization but to likely break the law. Shota tossed the feather up in the air. It darted away to swirl with the others. He put his hands back in his pockets. It almost sounds like a setup to take me down. Hawks let his head fall backwards, his wings collapsed down, the tips sweeping the ground. A single hand raised to cover his face. He let out a long groan, before looking through his fingers at Shota. Anyone ever told you, you're really paranoid? He let the hand slowly slip down his face, his eyelids pulled down enough to show the pink. Shota felt his lips twitch into a small smirk. My fiance tells me every day. Red wings twitched and gold eyes sharpened into an intense stare. Good, he caught it. Eraserhead never shares information about personal life, but Shota just dropped a huge nugget. It was an offered hand of trust. Hawks just needed to take it. So are you willing to help? The large wings puffed up even though the rest of the young hero's body stayed totally still. The unending golden gaze made Shota almost jealous. He wished he could go without blinking for just as long. Absolutely. Shota tilted his head forward in a half nod. Hawks let out a soft sigh as his shoulders slumped and his wings shook in excitement. I said I would take the fall if I can keep this kid safe, and I wasn't kidding. Just from the little shown here I am willing to risk the chance that I will end up in some HPSC cell. Hawks bobbed his head. Good. I just want Izuku out of there. I won't report you if we break any laws. Just being under the HPSC isn't horrible, but no other kid should go through that. The feathers started swirling in more and more complex patterns. The young hero started shuffling a little as he watched the dancing and twirling feathers. He has to have it worse in some ways from what I saw too. I've asked him, but Izuku won't talk about what's happening to him, and I hate to assume the worst, but the handlers like to use mind-twisting logic and awful punishments to get me to do. The almost manic ramble came to a screeching halt. The feathers drifted to the dusty floor as Hawks twisted on the balls of his feet to face Shota once more. The young hero's eyes were wide, his wings spread fully out like he was about to take flight, but all his flight feathers were razor-sharp and glinting in the limited light of the dim warehouse. His breaths were fast and labored. He was the poster boy for the start of a panic attack. Shota raised his hands slowly, curling his shoulders, hunching and bending his knees to be about the same height as Hawks. He let his face soften in ways he only does when his students or civilians need reassurance. Cursing his naturally gruff voice, he tried to soften the harsh edges as he quietly spoke. Hawks, it's okay. I am on board with you. Izuku needs out of the HPSC. I am not going to hurt you. You don't need to explain your position with the commission. If you want to, I am willing to listen. I'm not going to judge you either way. But what we need to do is get Izuku out of there. Anything else is secondary. As Shota continued talking, the kid slowly relaxed. Hawks sank into a seat on the ground. His wings switched back to puffy feathers and slowly moved into almost make a protective shield around him. Not being able to fully see Hawks from the wings shading him, Shota couldn't tell if he'd fully relaxed, but the labored breaths had slowed and evened out. After a few minutes, the hero poked his head out of his feathery cocoon, his gold eyes shimmering with unshed tears in the dim light. Sorry, I dunno what that was. My bad. He let out an awkward chuckle. But we need to make some sort of plan. To get Izuku out, right? Looking at the unsure look on the kid's face broke Shota's heart. The usually self-assured to almost cocky hero looked about as sure as his most self-conscious first years, meaning not at all. The lost look had an underlying desperation, screaming for reassurance and direction. Hawks was practically a child still shoved into a situation that was obviously out of his comfort zone and likely incredibly triggering. Shota was honestly impressed he hadn't freaked out more. Shota wasn't an idiot and could read between the lines. Hawks at some point was like Izuku and was likely legally transferred into HPSC custody or somehow illegally trafficked, and wasn't just trained to be a hero but was raised to be one. Shota knew he threaded the needle as a UA teacher between raising future heroes and creating child soldiers. But the HPSC was obviously tipping the scales solidly into the child soldier side of things. It made Shota fill with a cold form of rage. Hawks had said he'd dealt with mind-twisting logic, which sounded an awful lot like manipulation, and awful punishments, likely physical abuse, by the hands of the HPSC for who knows how long. Shota swore to himself that not only would he help Izuku but that he would help Hawks. His closeness to the HPSC was likely not a choice or even remotely healthy. Shota knew a rat that would likely love to take a little bird under his protection. Especially if Hawks can provide blackmail for the HPSC. The excessive security at UA could also hold Izuku from being recaptured illegally, and the need for warrants and other bureaucratic nonsense would at least delay and hold off the commission if there is some legal trail for their custody of the kid. He was probably getting ahead of himself. I have a few ideas and people that I trust implicitly. Some are powerful enough that they could hold off the HPSC from getting back at Izuku, or anyone else that needs protection. Shota pointedly looked at the young hero. The golden blank stare gave nothing away. I will need to read all of the intel you have collected. I am assuming you are being watched. Yeah, Hawks nodded. As his wings shifted, Shota saw he was hugging his knees. Almost constantly, I have ways to get around with some things. Like meeting up with you. I trashed the cameras and mics in my apartment, which I've done periodically since I was 16. So they won't freak out and will just replace them when I am patrolling tomorrow. Shota grimaced, but nodded. It was horrifying that Hawks was so normalized to that all. I figured it might be something like that. I will want to talk to Izuku's mom to get her side of things. I will also reach out to my contacts to make strategies for protecting Izuku and who could assist in the extraction and gathering more insider intel. There is no point in extracting the kid if he is captured again. Makes sense. The kid nodded, and let out a soft cooing noise as he closed his eyes and set his head on his knees. Shota crouched down into a squat and awkwardly shuffled forward to be about half a meter from Hawks. While I do all that organizing, you have two main jobs. The kid didn't raise his head, but his eyes flashed open and looked at Shota with rapt attention. First, you need to act like nothing's wrong or different, continue your patrols, do your public relations nonsense, smile for the cameras, all that. You are good at putting on that show, keep it up so the HPSC can't sniff that there is something up. Are you willing to do that? Hawks nodded, his cheek grinding into his knee. His face was blank, but Shota could tell he wasn't overly fond of that task. Tough luck, it was needed. Secondly, I need you to keep up the contact with Izuku as much as you both can. This got the kid to snap his head up, the blank look was sharp and focused. His feathers puffed up as his wings twitched. Shota bit back a smile. This was a task the young hero was obviously excited for. He is going to need support, and having a hero there to help be emotional support will be key. Building that trust will be helpful depending on how we plan to extract him. Additionally, if he shares any helpful information, we might be able to get him out faster. But we don't want to push too hard. Does that make sense? Hawks bobbed his head, and Shota let a small smile twist the corners of his lips. You seem to be doing a good job at this too. Taking 3 days to get his name might seem like a long time, but I have worked with contacts for months before learning their full name. You gained that boy's trust quickly, but not pushed to scare him off. And you reached out for additional help the same day, so we will get Izuku out of there as fast as we can. And that was all because of you. You are going to help save Izuku. You are a good hero. Thanks. Hawk's big gold eyes looked a little shiny and his voice was just a whisper. His wings fully tucked behind his back, showing the tight grip he had on the legs of his sweatpants. Was Shota treating Hawks like one of his stressed overachieving perfectionist students? Absolutely. But the kid needed someone to take over the reins, it seemed. This all was too close to him and it was abundantly clear. He also needed that reassurance, and Shota mentally cursed the commission for denying this kid from the things he obviously needed. Shota telegraphed his movements as he reached out a hand towards the kid's messy windswept hair. The kid didn't seem to be stressed over it, so Shota rested his hand on the young hero's head. The golden hair was soft under Shota's fingers, and after a soft tussle the underground hero was surprised to find some long, very thin feathers mixed into the strands of hair. Hawks leaned into the touch with a very bird-like coo. The action melted Shota's heart even further. Either this kid is the best manipulator of all time or is actually just an overwhelmed teen. Shota should listen to his paranoia, but the larger part of him really believed that Hawks was just in over his head and needed a lot. Shota let a genuine smile soften his face further. Any time, Hawks. And while Hawks might realize it, Shota meant it literally. He would be there for this kid. He was so capable of being a hero, just needed someone to be there to reassure him that there would be someone to catch him if he fell. Shota doubted the kid would fall in any meaningful way, but reassurance can go a long way. Keigo. What? Keigo. My given name. Hawks. Keigo's big molten gold eyes looked up at Shota. Shota felt the same raising joy he'd felt when he got the alley kittens to trust him to feed out of his hand. Okay. Anytime, Keigo. Shota stood, his knees popping dramatically. Before he twisted to leave, he smiled at the kid once again. Aizawa. Shota, I look forward to working with you. Hawks nodded, wiping his eyes with the palm of his hand. A red feather just longer than Shota's hand swayed and fluttered from Hawks' mid-wing to just in front of the underground hero's eyes. Use this if you need to contact me. If there is an emergency, break it. And I'll be there. I will keep you up to date on my end. Let me know how it goes with Izuku. We'll get him out of there. I know we will. Shota nodded and turned. Almost out of the warehouse, he turned his head over his shoulder to look back at the young hero who was still curled up on the ground. Keigo was looking much more relaxed but 100 times more exhausted. Take care of yourself, kid. With that, Shota left the warehouse. Using his capture weapon, he catapulted himself up to the roof of an apartment. He was supposed to be patrolling for another 45 minutes, but the papers tucked under his arm were screaming to be read. Shota decided to text the neighboring patrolling underground hero that he was having to leave a little early. The hero sent back a text stating that they were okay keeping an eye out for the hour. With that, Shota headed back to his apartment to start his investigation. Hopefully he'd get a few hours of sleep, or his trip to the prison would be incredibly unpleasant. Chapter text. Kyoto Women's Facility for the Criminally Insane was concerningly easy to get into. Shota had made one phone call, gave them his hero ID, and they told him that they would drag Ms. Midoriya out immediately for whatever he needed. The man on the phone insinuated that if he wanted they could give the two of them a room with no interruptions or extra eyes, if he'd prefer it that way. Shota, silently horrified, said he could work around her schedule and that normal protocols for visitors would likely work just fine. The man just laughed it off and said if he ever changed his mind just call back and they'd make it work out for him. Hanging up after getting the time that Ms. Midoriya had free time, Shota stared at the shiny black glass of the phone in his hand long after the screen had timed out. He hoped that wasn't implying what he thought it was. But it probably was. Shaking his head to make himself focus, Shota turned his phone back on and scrolled through his contacts. He hovered his thumb over the contact listed as Rat Boss. After a few tense seconds he opened the message app. It was too early to call Nedzu. It was always too early to call Nedzu. Greater than possible abuse of power at Kyoto Women's Facility for the Criminally Insane. Implications include prostitution of inmates and likely neglect of proper care. Additionally, there is a topic that I need to speak with you in person about later today. The principal's response was almost immediate. Shota hated morning people. Greater than I appreciate the tip, Shota-kun. It has been too long since I have been able to shut down a corrupt institution. This will be a delightful task to warm up my brain this morning. A little birdie told me that you and I will both be free today during tea time at 4 p.m. I am excited to hear more about what might be ruffling your feathers and offer any assistance that I may. With my eagle eyes I might be able to swoop down and see a good solution to whatever troubles you. Greater than I will be there. Greater than I look forward to it. Shota pocketed his phone, suppressing a shiver. He wished he was surprised that his boss already knew at least something about what was going on, but the rat always seemed to be at least tentatively aware of everything all the time. Shota knew some of his tricks of how he gained his information, but it was only a fraction. The principal had joked about trackers and subcutaneous microphones enough that Shota wouldn't be surprised if he'd chipped all his teachers at least. He tried not to think too hard about it and was just grateful that Nedzu was on their side. It also made Shota's life a little bit easier a lot of the time. It was illogical to deny the usefulness and efficiency of Nedzu's questionable methods. No matter how creepy and invasive they were. Looking at the clock on the wall of his and Hizashi's apartment, he saw that his fiancée would be waking up any second now. Shota sighed. There was no way that he would be getting any sleep, so he might as well make a nice breakfast for the two of them before he skipped class to head over to the prison facility. Hizashi stumbled into the kitchen. His glasses were askew and his hearing aids were in his hand. Shota turned, handing him a plate with an omelet steaming on it. He smiled at the slightly bleary and confused face that contorted his fiancée's face. Hizashi took the plate with a small bow and sat at the table, shoving his hearing aids into his ears. Shota followed him with his own plate and a cup of coffee. He let himself collapse over the cup of coffee, drinking from it deeply, ignoring the burning of his tongue. So, what's the special occasion? Hizashi lifted a piece of the omelet into the air with his chopsticks before taking a bite. Not like I mind waking up to a breakfast made with love on a random day. Maybe it's just because I love you, Shota mumbled while staring blankly at his fiancée over the rim of his mug. I love you too, but you look stressed and like you haven't slept all night. I haven't, not really. Hizashi's whole face softened as he stretched a hand forward to put his hand over Shota's. Why didn't you wake me? You know I don't mind helping you after nightmares, and you know it helps, Shota cut him off. Wasn't nightmares. Hizashi didn't look convinced. Shota put down the mug. It wasn't. Okay. He took another bite before looking back up. So what was it? A new case from an unlikely informant. A bad one. Needed immediate attention. Shota, I could have helped with that too. You know that. I do. You just looked too peaceful, I didn't want to wake you. Shota felt his cheeks flush and cursed how well Hazashi could read the small facial cues that hid behind his deadpan. The bright teasing grin on his fiancée's face made Shota's face burn hotter. As absolutely adorable that is, you can wake me up even when I am too cute. The grin softened as Hazashi squeezed Shota's hand. I want you to take care of yourself, and sleeping is part of that. So if I can help speed some of your late nights up, I'd do it gladly. Shota nodded as he slid his hand out from under Hazashi's. He took a big bite of his omelet, not fully trusting his voice. He just loved Hazashi too much, and soft moments brought it forward to the forefront of his mind again and again. So, can I help with anything? Case or generally? Swallowing, Shota started to slide the now organized file towards the other hero. Hazashi looked a little confused when Shota didn't let the file slide out from under his fingers. Making eye contact, Shota set down his chopsticks on the edge of his plate. If you read this, you might end up aiding and abetting a major felony or being complicit in efforts to take down a part of the government. Taurus-level punishments if this goes down wrong. Keep that in mind before choosing to read what's in this file. Holy s. Shota, what did you stumble into? Hazashi laughed before wiggling his eyebrows. And you know I'm a bit too ride or die to not help, love. You are stuck with me and maybe I can sweet talk the guards to let us have some conjugal visits, or even better just to share a cell. I'm being serious, Hazashi. Shota looked into Hazashi's green eyes, hoping the seriousness of this case would entail with only a hard stare. So am I. The green eyes looked back at the black eyes with stubborn reckless abandon. Shota raised his hand, letting his fiancée take the file. With a sigh he started to explain everything that had happened last night with Hawks. Talking about his personal research into the Midoriya family and tentatively the families that were friends of the Midoriyas. How his phone call earlier with the prison center Midoriya Inko was being held had gone. Groaning about how Nezu was now involved a tad earlier than he'd originally planned due to it, and how he had 2 meetings today, both of which would likely impact his ability to teach his classes. Well, I could cover 2 of your classes during my break periods and Nimari could do the last one, which would line up to your meeting with Ms. Midoriya. I don't think you are qualified to teach law to the 3rd years, Hazashi. Excuse me, I am a hero and had to take law classes too, and I got better grades than you at UA, if I remember correctly. And I was just planning on just giving them some class time to work on the essay I know you assigned them. He looked back down at the file, flipping through the pages a little absent-mindedly before his head shot up. Wait, hey, why is Nimari more qualified to teach the 3rd years than I am? Shota grinned as he drank the last of his now lukewarm coffee. She doesn't have a vigilante conviction on her records. You went out more often than I ever did. How can you teach them then? Ah, but I have no convictions on my record. So I might as well be a model citizen. Shota laughed at Hazashi's strangled scream as he stood and put his plate in the sink. As Shota moved into the back of the apartment to get ready for the day, he heard his fiancée grumble about hypocrisy and how he'd show Shota a model citizen. It took everything in Shota to not bust up laughing. Walking into the Kyoto Women's Facility for the Criminally Insane was an odd experience for Shota. He had visited prisons and mental institutions before, but the way this place mixed the two left him feeling off-kilter. The guards, or were they nurses, were dressed in slightly off-white scrubs, but had tasers or billy clubs strapped to their thighs. Shota had signed in at the reception on a simple clipboard, but also had to go through what felt like 8 levels of security to be admitted. The cheerful paintings on the walls and the pop of color tiles floor juxtaposed with the thick steel cage doors and the shackles that were seemingly worn even inside the cells. Observations of the women left a sour taste in Shota's mouth. Some were pacing, the clinking and clattering of the chains echoed down the halls to mix with the low-level muttering and a few low s and sobs. Others were curled up on their thin mattresses or sitting on the floor against the wall looking bored out of their minds. Some were obviously drugged. The worst, however, were the few women whose silent pointed looks cut him right to his core with their hostile distrust peppered with resigned exhaustion. Had Shota not already contacted Nezu, he would have after walking through these halls. The reactions and interactions he'd had in such a short time of even knowing about this place screamed that something was wrong. Unfortunately, he knew that he needed to keep his thoughts and theories to himself. Possibly having to play along if necessary. He didn't want his suspicion to clue in the bad actors in this institution. Nedzu liked the chase and would dig them out regardless, but things needed to be dealt with quickly. And with how open they are to showing their bad behavior, Nedzu could have this institute shut down within the month. Maybe even a few weeks. As their walk continued, Shota felt himself tense, coiling ready to spring to action. Eraserhead had done undercover work in the past, but somehow infiltrating an illegal Quirk fighting ring felt safer than whatever insidious thing hid in this building. Lucky for Shota, there weren't any overt illegalities playing out in front of him, the only highly questionable thing being a warning from the nurse guard that had been leading him, giving him a warning about how the cameras wouldn't shut off until 30 seconds after the door buzzed closed. Shota only nodded before he turned to walk in the room, only to be stopped by a firm grip on his arm. He turned back to look directly in the hard eyes of the other man. A word for the wise. Midoriya in there might be pretty and look harmless, but she's sent more people to the hospital than any other inmate at this point. So proceed with caution. The man looked him up and down, then smirked. But you seem like the type to be into that kind of thing, so, he clapped a hand on Shota's shoulder, the smirk growing larger. Enjoy. Shota was practically shoved through the door, stumbling. His hip hit the sturdy metal table that was bolted to the center of the floor. The chairs around the table were luckily pushed in all the way, or he would have tripped over the ones closest to him. Pulling out his own chair, he felt sick and off-kilter. Shota hoped that his imagination and paranoia had mixed to make some greater horror than what he was imagining. He hoped that there was some innocuous and non-sinister explanation to what he'd seen, but Shota was a realist, Hazashi would say a pessimist, and he doubted that would be the case. After a few seconds, the door on the opposite side of the table opened with a buzz and Ms. Midoriya walked through the door with thin chains restraining her wrists and ankles. The woman who had walked in behind her knelt down to release the chains from around the tight cuffs on her ankles, then stood to do the same with her wrists. No one in the room made any noise during the process, only the metallic sounds of the chains sliding onto the floor cut through the oppressive silence. Once finished, the woman paused, staring straight at Shota with a look he couldn't begin to identify before she turned to leave. The door loudly slid shut before the electronic buzz sounded, making Ms. Midoriya jump. If Shota was being honest, he had jumped a little too. The two looked at each other standing on opposite sides of the small room with the metal table wedged between them. Shota took the time to take in Ms. Midoriya. She was a short woman, the top of her head might reach his shoulder on a good day. Her bright orange scrub-like jumpsuit clashed with her loose long hair, making her look a bit like a pumpkin or a carrot. Her cheeks were round with a few faint freckles darkening the tops of her cheeks and the bridge of her nose. It gave her a youthful, innocent look, but the bright green eyes with deep circles under them bored deeply into Shota and screamed danger. This was a mother bear ready to do absolutely anything she needed to get back to her cub, even if that meant going through Shota to get there. Good. The reports Shota had read on the woman were accurate. She cared deeply for her son. And being trapped here for the past year had not dimmed that love but only heightened it, making it more heightened and aggressive. Distance might make the heart grow fonder, but it also spawned parents like Ms. Midoriya to rain down fire and brimstone on those that forced it. Shota couldn't deny he looked forward to the light show. Ms. Midoriya opened her mouth, about to speak, only for Shota to hold up a finger. She looked at him, confused only for dawning realization to settle over her face as her eyes flicked to the corner where the camera was screwed to the ceiling, only to flick back to him with a slight nod. Shota blinked in surprise. Most civilians he'd interacted with hadn't been that quick on the uptake. Once his mental count hit 30, Shota nodded and slowly moved to sit onto the uncomfortable metal chair. He gestured for Ms. Midoriya to do the same. She only looked at Shota with suspicion, refusing to move from her spot close to the far wall. "Who are you?" Her voice was harsh in a way Shota hadn't expected. Green eyes flashed in the oppressive fluorescent lighting, her posture coiled ready for a fight. "I am a hero, I just want to help." Ms. Midoriya leaned against the wall and crossed her arms with an unbelieving huff. She reminded him of some of his more ornery students, even down to the eye roll paired with a small shake of her head. "My Quirk, She flourished her right hand, wiggling her fingers towards him, as resistant to inhibitors, as you likely know. Shota had indeed not known, and stored that information away, making sure to not let his face change in his surprise. It wasn't common to have a resistant quirk, but it wasn't unheard of. Ms. Midoriya took menacing steps forward, gracefully moving around the table similar to the way a cat would when on the hunt. Her sharp, observant, neutral expression took on a menacing manic edge. You are far from the first to come here to try to tame me, Mr. Hero. She leaned forward, looming over him, the hate dripped from each syllable making Shota flinch back slightly. Her voice lowered to a dangerous purr as she slinked forward, closing the distance between the two. Shota could feel her puff out a small breath, now practically nose to nose. Every freckle and each faint wrinkle around her eyes were in high definition. He was so focused on the face that he almost missed what she hissed out. Try to touch me and say bye-bye to your testicles. Color Shota impressed. It was hard to intimidate someone so thoroughly, especially with so many points going against Ms. Midoriya. But he felt the adrenaline flood his veins as his heart pounded in his chest. He was almost disappointed the cameras were off, as this would have been a great master class for his students on intimidation. So many students complained about being born without the things to make them intimidating, but Ms. Midoriya proved him right. Anyone can be intimidating if they worked with what they had. Shota mentally shook off the ways he'd love to integrate her example into his lectures, focusing back on Ms. Midoriya. He blinked up at her, slowly observing how the short woman was doing her best to tower over him. He had to hold back a grin as he realized that she'd been standing on her tiptoes and he hadn't even realized. He needed to diffuse the conversation but hoped he'd have a chance to congratulate her without it sounding horribly condescending. I wasn't planning on touching you in any way, so glad to know that my balls will be safe. The intimidating aura rippling off of Ms. Midoriya slowly evened out as confusion took over. She sank back onto her heels, her eyes only slightly above Shota's as he sat. She took a few steps back to stand by the empty chair. She looked at it warily before glancing back at Shota like the metal chair was somehow a trick. I am only here to ask a few questions. I don't plan on doing anything else. Sit or stand, it doesn't really matter to me. Shota hoped that Ms. Midoriya would sit, but it was more for her to be more comfortable. He made sure to stay totally still, even taking measured breaths in a hope to put her at ease. It worked as Ms. Midoriya ever so slowly lowered herself into the chair. She was wound tightly, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Shota took that as a win and slumped back into his chair. The metal dug into his back. He felt like he had gotten an alley cat to take a few steps towards him, but not quite close enough to pet. His obvious relaxed posture let Ms. Midoriya relax slightly in her own seat. Her hands bunched up the thin orange fabric over her thighs. I'm not big on pleasantries, but I will introduce myself. I am the pro hero Eraserhead. I've come to get your side of the story regarding your son's disappearance. She slumped further into her seat. Her face loosened to look utterly exhausted in ways that Shota could empathize with. She took a deep breath before she spoke plainly. I don't know what I could tell you that hasn't already been said 1,000 times. But I did not murder my son. I never thought you did. That caught her attention. The haze of exhaustion blinked away instantly, only leaving clear and intense focus. She leaned forward over the table. The thin cuffs on her wrists clattered on the table. You don't think I killed Izuku. You don't think I am some sick woman who snapped under the weight of being a single mother. Her face was guarded and her words were even, but Shota thought he could see some spark of something hidden in her green eyes. He shook his head. Ms. Midoriya leaned back with a small huff and a tiny smile. Well, Mr. Eraserhead, this is a first. What makes you any different? It was Shota's turn to slowly lean forward. I have a witness who not only saw, but has continued communication with your son. Izuku's alive. Shota nodded, giving her a soft smile. Green eyes flooded with tears as Ms. Midoriya's whole body collapsed back in relief. She took some deep stuttering breaths before she wiped the tears that had cascaded down her round cheeks. She rolled her shoulders, her gaze hardened with determination as she shifted to the edge of her seat. I'll tell you everything. And she did. She was a wealth of information, giving him her story in vivid detail. Shota had taken out a recording device and asked a few questions here and there to guide her, but she only needed prompting a few times as she was methodical. Ms. Midoriya, call me Inko, spoke of many letters and agents reaching out trying to convince her to sign over her parental rights. They used complex legalese to explain how it would be safer for Izuku, how they would make sure she got visitation, how they would care for her son and make sure she was well compensated. At first she'd thought it was fairly innocuous as Izuku had gotten some local publicity due to his efforts to help his friend with quirkless discrimination in the local middle school. She'd always refused the agents and ignored the letters and got more and more concerned as they got more pushy and frustrated in tone. But she'd brushed it off as it was the HPSC, a part of the government, and she'd never imagined them being able to do anything more than be an annoyance. A thorn in her side. One day Inko's friend had told her about some strange people in suits asking about her and her family. Then people at her job started asking about the daily rotation of people asking about her, but would disappear if they went to go get Inko. One, Bakugo Mitsuki, only half joking, asked Inko if she'd somehow gotten mixed up with the Yakuza. It was that comment that really pushed Inko over the edge and led to her first call to the police. Once she'd accepted that there was a real danger to her son and possibly her, she'd started to notice the constant strangers tailing her. At some point Izuku also noticed and was genuinely terrified. Inko described through watery eyes about how her son had broken down in tears about how he didn't feel safe anymore, and asked if they were going to steal him away because of his quirk. She'd contacted the police again that day and only got a CPS visit. Izuku had refused to go to school or leave the apartment even with a friend with a volatile quirk, and her walking with him, so she'd pulled him out and transferred him to an online curriculum. She'd called out to work, taking all of her sick days and vacation consecutively, and started making plans to move up north with her parents, hoping that it would all blow over, and maybe having 2 additional adults could make Izuku feel more safe. Of course, before anything could actually get solidified, 5 people broke into her apartment, breaking down the door while she was making dinner. Inko heard the door splinter and ran out to try to fight the 5 people off the best she could. She had used her quirk to attract knives from the kitchen block to shoot out and got a few good cuts. All but one of the people ducked behind the living room furniture. They were able to grab Izuku and brought him out with a hand gripped tightly around his throat. Inko's eyes at this point cycled between shame, horror and pride as she graphically described pulling the man's eyes out of his skull. The man had apparently screamed and let go of the boy. Inko grabbed him and ran out of the apartment. She didn't know who started the fire, but she smelled the smoke as she got to the end of the hall. One of the remaining kidnappers had some sort of agility quirk and had been able to catch up much faster than the rest. Inko had kicked them, pushing Izuku to run down the stairs. She tried her best, but when the other 3 circled, she'd been overwhelmed. She pulled with her quirk, doing who knows what type of damage to their internal systems, and kicked, bit and scratched to keep them from going down the stairway. But once she'd finally fallen to the ground and had one of the kidnappers kicking in her ribs, she'd heard a scream that she said she still heard every night in her nightmares. It had been Izuku, her son, screaming as he ran out of the stairway and tried to tackle the man kicking his mom. Being a small 10-year-old, it hadn't worked, and the kidnappers just struggled to hold on to the kid as he squirmed and tried to get out of their hold. One of the kidnappers had a nail-sharpening quirk and had moved to slice the kid's cheek deeply. Inko pounced on the kidnappers as they were distracted. She'd struggled to Izuku, who was crying, and she'd held his bleeding cheek. He looked stricken and frozen, curled up by the wall. She felt a hand wrap around her neck. So she quickly gave her son a kiss and told him that she loved him. The kidnapper tore her away, chucking her down the hallway away from the stairs, and then grabbed the boy. They all ran off once Izuku was in their grip, totally ignoring as Inko ran after them. She'd been able to follow them for a decent amount of time. She had used her quirk to ruin their getaway car, pulling on any small parts that she could get a grip on with her quirk. From the distance she'd given herself a nosebleed and was dizzy, but kept chasing them. The kidnappers had ducked into a local illegal dump site of Dagoba Beach. She'd lost them in the massive piles of trash, and collapsed from quirk exhaustion and her various half-healed injuries. Once she woke back up some time later, the world was still fuzzy and off. Inko was honest and said she wasn't sure if it was shock or some head injury, but in her haze she knew she kept walking around the trash searching for Izuku. She'd continued her fruitless search until she was taken into custody by the police. Hearing her sigh as the justice system failed her again and again was painful for Shota, as she listed hundreds of times she'd been accused of lying, being a hysterical or crazy woman, or being met with hostility, being outright told that she deserved the rough treatment as she was obviously guilty of killing her own child. She cried as she told Shota that she believed that she had killed her son, but not in the direct way that they had meant. She hollowly told him how everyone had stopped looking for Izuku almost immediately after starting. Shota felt his heart crack as Inko's eyes went distant as she told him about how police had come to her with Izuku's death certificate, telling her that she should just tell them where his body was so her little boy could get the rest that he deserved. She'd never backed down from her actual story, and Shota couldn't help but admire her for it, even as she confessed to him about being left confused and mentally conflicted, as she was almost convinced that it had all been some psychotic break. Looking at the woman pulling herself together again and again as she told her story, a determined glint in her eye as she wiped her face, Shota hoped that Izuku had inherited her tenacity and determination. If he hadn't, Shota feared what mental state the kid might be in when they rescued him. He was worried regardless, but with that level of mental fortitude might allow the kid to heal and possibly have a relatively normal life after all this. Shota's brow was deeply furrowed in thought when Inko cleared her throat, derailing his train of thought. "Please, please, save my Izuku," she swallowed as her eyes flicked to the corner of the room. Her voice was hoarse and clogged with emotion. She looked Shota directly in the eyes, making him want to squirm. "I never thought I'd even have the chance to see him again. Thank you for giving me hope again." Shota actually shifted in his chair, something writhing deep in his gut. Statistics of kidnappings echoed in his mind as visions of dead and maimed children flooded his mind's eye. There was a solid chance that he was here giving this mother hope, only to have to later crush it under his heel. "I can't make any promises, Inko. I need you to understand that." Inko's red-rimmed irritated eyes softened as she gave him the most genuine smile. She reached forward to give a comforting pat to the back of his hand. "I don't doubt that you'll do everything in your power to help my son, Eraserhead. And for that I am forever going to be grateful." Shota nodded as he ducked his face into his capture scarf. He slipped his hand from under hers to cross his arms. He felt like his skin was squirming and he wanted the attention off of him. He blurted the first thing that came to mind. "Tell me about him." Inko blinked, surprised. "Izuku." Shota gave a quick short nod. Inko then melted into a wide grin. "He is amazing. And I know that all moms say that, but he is genuinely spectacular. He almost single-handedly rooted out quirkless discrimination from our local middle school for a friend. He is smarter than I ever could be. He can figure out how a hero's quirk works from a short clip online. He seems to have memorized every single hero and is wildly obsessed with some of the most obscure ones that I've definitely never heard of." Her smile shifted into something more intimate and glowing. "He is so kind, not just nice. He is always willing to help. Sometimes he is so selfless that it scares me. He wants to be a hero so badly, and I know if given the chance he will save so many." Inko's red-rimmed eyes filled with tears, a few tears rolling down her lightly freckled cheeks. I know him well enough that he'll one day give too much of himself and he won't be able to come home to me." A bitter laugh soured the warm atmosphere. "I worry he'll be forced to give too much of himself before you can get to him." "What do you mean?" Inko looked a little confused by his question before the lightbulb flickered on behind her eyes. "His quirk. The doctor who tested him told me it was likely on par with recovery girls. But instead of a kiss he heals whenever he is injured or in pain. He cannot control it past avoiding injury, or staying away from other people who are injured. It's a chronic quirk. Holy s." Shota mumbled to himself, rubbing his hand over his stubble. "No wonder he was taken. I tried to keep it hidden as much as I could. My friends don't even know the full extent of his quirk. But how was I supposed to hide it from the organization responsible for the registry?" Inko looked haunted by years' worth of sleepless nights and endless anxiety. In that moment she embodied exhaustion in ways that Shota, the man known for looking tired, couldn't even begin to attempt. Shota leaned forward and offered his hand to Inko. She looked surprised as she took it. Shota gripped it as he hoped the rolling internal emotions were funneled into outward determination. I'm going to do everything I can to not only save Izuku but help him be safe in the future. No child's life should be destroyed because of their quirk. Please, take care of him." Her voice was nothing more than a faint whisper. Her eyes were misty once more. She moved her other hand to squeeze his hand tight enough her hands shook and it hurt. It was like she was trying to use the grip to make up for how quiet her words were. Shota met her wet eyes with solidifying resolution. "I will see to it personally." Something in Shota settled with his words. He would do everything to keep this promise. Inko sniffed as she nodded with a smile. She removed her hands from his to scrub at her face. Shota leaned into the hard edge of his seat and watched as she once more pulled herself back together. "I'd like to help you too, you know." Inko paused, a hand on her cheek as her wide eyes bore into him. She squinted at him before quickly finishing up her self-cleanup. "What do you know?" She sounded and looked hesitant in ways she had yet to show in their conversation. She refused to meet his eyes, which constricted something in Shota's chest. He sighed, bringing a hand up to rub his eyes. "Only that something is majorly wrong here. But nothing concrete. I was practically forced to talk to you here unsupervised. The way the women I passed acted along with the guards' attitudes have been off. And of course the fact that a kind-hearted woman like yourself felt that her first words to a hero should be to threaten their manhood is a bit of a red flag." Inko let out a strangled squeak as her face flushed bright red. Shota bit back a smile as he took a short pause to compose himself before continuing. "I can tell it's off in ways that are obvious, but I'm going to need more than just a hero's intuition, or bad vibes, to genuinely fix anything." Inko nodded, looking pensive. Before she finally made tentative eye contact, she looked scared. "Let's just say that you aren't the first hero or official who has come in there and asked for one-on-one time with an inmate they don't know." She paused, her face scrunching like she'd tasted something sour. "Some of the women here call it the Kyoto brothel. Not everyone is taken aside. It's only the ones that have been flagged as having psychotic episodes. Anyone with a supposed tentative hold-on reality who tries to come forward about an attack can be passed off as taking a break from reality or being paranoid." She shrugged like she was remarking on something as simple as the weather. Shota knew that he was normalized to a lot of horrible things, but seeing someone who should be horrified just not be, felt wrong to him. "Have you been attacked before?" He mentally crossed his fingers hoping Inko had not. "Well, they've tried but none have been successful." A small smirk twitched at the corners of her mouth. "Learning that I can pull on a person's eyes or she flicked down towards Shota's crotch briefly and cleared her throat. "Other similarly sized organs have been of great use here." The playful aura faded as her shoulders slumped. "Others here have not been so lucky. Do you have any names of those that attacked you or others?" Inko shook her head. "No, sorry. Don't apologize. You have already given leads for other possible victims to talk to. Or which visitation records to look into. You have been very helpful. Thank you. I know a lot of the women here did commit crimes, but..." Shota cut her off. "No one deserves this type of treatment. Criminal record or otherwise." Shota suddenly felt tired. He let out a sigh as he rubbed his eyes. "I likely won't be heavily involved in this investigation. I've got other priorities, as you are already aware. And honestly, this sort of case is outside of my normal wheelhouse. That being said, I have already flagged this institution as a concern to the pro-hero Nedzu to look into. I have it on good authority that dismantling corrupt organizations is one of his favorite pastimes, so he has likely already started his own investigation. I say this all to ask if it would be okay with you to give him the recording of this conversation and give your name as a witness. I'd love to help in any way I can." "Good." Shota stood, his knees popped loudly. "I will try to come back to update you once we've made progress regarding your son. I might also have to send a different hero depending on how it goes. But fair warning, it might take a while. I'll learn to live with the suspense." She stood and then gave Shota a low bow. "Just knowing that people like you are out there trying to help him means the world." Shota felt his stomach twist once again as he gestured for her to stand up. He looked into her watery eyes. He saw a spark that was not there before they'd spoken. She looked exhausted and wrung out but lighter and hopeful. He felt like he needed to say or do something but wasn't sure what. After a slightly too long of a pause, Shota gave her a slight bow. Take care of yourself, Inko. You too, Eraserhead. Shota. He didn't know why he felt he should give her his name, but he did. He hadn't even given his family name, but jumped right to his given name, one that he hadn't even let his best friends use. Sometimes when he was feeling petty he made his fiance call him Aizawa instead of Shota. But it felt right and seemed like the correct thing to do as Inko lightened even more with a smile. Thank you, Shota. Without another word, Shota moved to buzz the guard to let him out. Shota looked back at Inko briefly, as the nurse guard rechained her cuffs. Her green eyes sparkled as she watched him leave. Shota shivered as he exited the facility. He needed a shower. Hero worship always made him feel dirty. Chapter text. Keigo hated to admit it, but waiting was going to actually kill him. Full dead. Heart stopped on the floor naked in the bathroom dead. He'd told Eraserhead Aizawa that he would be able to play the perfectly normal, happy, healthy, media-savvy, suave, new up-and-coming hero. But it had been less than 4 hours since he'd made that promise, and Keigo genuinely wasn't sure he would be able to last the next 24 hours. Keigo tried sleeping only to last 15 minutes, if he was being generous. He tossed and turned before he gave up. He tried to write reports for the commission and for his agency. After the 1000th time Keigo had to go back and reread what he had just written, he decided that middle of the night Keigo might be too tired and wired to write anything that would be cohesive. Shoving work off onto future him, he tried to lay down and watch TV, only to fail at that too. He shut off the TV after realizing a whole episode of whatever he'd put on had gone by without him noticing, and all he'd done was pace around his apartment fiddling with feathers on his wings and fluffing up the cushions in his living room. In a fit of desperation he downed a mug of lavender chamomile, calming tea while listening to ambient ocean sounds. He still felt wired, so he laid on the floor and tried to force a meditation. But like everything else, it didn't work. The feather that was tucked away in some secret HPSC facility was constantly in his mental cache. Checking it again and again and again was gumming up his mind, spiraling deeper and deeper into the mess that was the parts of his mind that Keigo always shoved to the side and ignored for more important things like being a hero. But this was making that seem impossible. What he actually wanted to do was go flying, but doing that twice in one night would be suspicious to any of the agents that were likely watching his apartment until they could bug it again. Hawks needed to act the part, but Keigo just couldn't get it together. The unending worry consumed him, dragging him down faster than he could flap his metaphorical wings. There was no escape, just continual constant unending worry with flashes of more and intense training. Punishments and tests Izuku could be going through. Keigo might be awake, but that was sort of by choice. But was Izuku also awake? Was the commission playing loud music and shining bright lights to prep him for the long sleepless nights of hero work? Or was he being shoved in a room so silent and dark that Izuku couldn't tell where he ended and the darkness began? Was he in pain, trying to self-nurse the cuts and bruises from the training the commission agents were exceptional at? Was Izuku cutting open his skin and dumping salt in the bleeding wounds to save another failure of a hero, again? He just couldn't know, and it was killing him. He felt his mind spin and grind, circling in the anxiety and imagining increasingly graphic images of the trapped boy in worse and worse situations. Keigo jumped up off the floor once again and started to dart around his apartment with manic energy. He used a feather to dust the generic art on the walls. He switched his lounge chair with the bean bag and then decided he didn't like that, only to switch them back. He took all the books off his shelf to then reorganize them by size. He went into his kitchen and switched the canned food shelf with his boxed food shelf and went through his fridge, throwing out all the off vegetables and the empty sauce containers he hadn't gotten around to throwing out. At some point he'd stopped his middle of the night reorganization and instead stood frozen, eyes facing the balcony window but not actually seeing anything. It felt like between one blink and the next the night sky was replaced by the rising sun, painting the sky in stunning pinks, yellows and reds. Keigo tilted his head at the sunrise and blinked. It was pretty. Could Izuku see the sun rise in the facility? He hoped he could. The excitable boy seemed like the type to appreciate little things like sunrises. An alarm blared in the other room, shaking Keigo from his frozen stupor. He needed to get a grip on himself, acting the way he had been would only raise suspicion. Keigo needed to pull himself together, act the way he had a week ago. Before he'd been injured. Before he'd seen the green bean. Before he has gotten to know the kid over feather instant messaging. Keigo wanted to go back to that so badly. But some line had been drawn in the sand. Some dam broke in Keigo's heart. The binary of before and now was so harsh that Keigo didn't know how to begin to pretend that his mind wasn't filled with visions of Izuku being trapped and tortured, sad and alone in the commission facility. A churning nausea rolled in his stomach. Keigo had to swallow back the acid trying to escape. On paper Keigo knew his assignment be normal. Play the part of Hawks. Raise no suspicion. He'd been given harder assignments, morally reprehensible assignments that left him filled with sleepless nights, or ones that left him feeling empty and hollow for days or weeks on end. This should be easy. He always played a part. Keigo was nothing if not an actor. Every smirk to a camera, every peace sign and wink to a fan, every willing bow as he took on one more assignment from the commission, all an act. He lived his life on a stage and he couldn't wait for the day he could take his bow and leave without being dragged back to do yet another encore. He was tired and this felt like he'd somehow ended up on stage with lights blinding him, and not only did he not know the lines or blocking of the production, but everyone was speaking in Vietnamese. It shouldn't be such an impossible seeming task, but it was. A second alarm started over top of the other. A more soothing melodic tune joined with the screeching beep beep. Keigo blinked, seeing the now blue sky over the other buildings out of his window. His mind felt like molasses as he realized that was his alarm warning him that he needed to head out on patrol. Keigo numbly pulled at the shirt he'd worn last night to meet Aizawa and just blankly stared at it. He consciously knew that he needed to change into his hero suit. But he wasn't really attached to his body anymore. More like whatever that made him grew like a moss on the outside of his body. His body was a rusted machine stuck in. No matter how hard he tried, Keigo couldn't force his joints to move. But he was no quitter, so he kept trying, and after some time he was able to woodenly stumble down the hall to his room. Mechanically he changed his clothes. The feeling of the soft fringe on his flight jacket rubbing along his cheek was like WD-40, allowing his joints to move, allowing him to settle a little further into himself. He had a leg swung over the balcony before he stopped himself, remembering that he had to do the bare minimum daily hygiene. He shuffled back to the bathroom and was extra grateful he did as the sharp bite of the spearmint on his tongue clicked everything back into place. The rhythmic brushing let him feel like he had a tentative hold on his own body. He splashed cold water on his face and felt the hold tighten. Looking at his own reflection in the mirror, Keigo grimaced at the blank, exhausted expression. Today was going to be rough. Dropping out of his window, he felt the rush of adrenaline as the air flew past. He snapped his wings open and ginned at the pounding in his chest and the energy that rushed through him. Finally, whatever nonsense from this morning was getting in the way was pushed to the side and he could do his job. Technically, Hawks was supposed to go to the winged agency building in person every morning before he started his patrol, but the idea of trying to pretend he wasn't maybe on the cusp of falling apart as his life got turned on his head was something that he just couldn't do. Skipping out on the in-person aspect of the check-in was something that he did semi-regularly, so it was unlikely to send any warning flags to the commission plants at his agency. It was doubly likely after an embarrassment, like slamming face first into a billboard after being distracted by a kid picking up one of his feathers to ramble about some obscure aquatic hero, as a totally unrelated example and not something that had happened the day before. However, on an unrelated note, Hawks wanted to look up more about Periphyton, the encrusting hero. She sounded cool. Keigo chewed on his lip as he soared high above the city, sending off some feathers here and there. Some went to help carry groceries for some older folks, others to stop children from running out into the street, and a small group of feathers to help a pet cat out of a tree. He wasn't going to lie, he was kind of bored. Don't get him wrong. He didn't wish for tragedy on the civilians in his area, but a small part of Keigo wished for more and was a little bit bummed over the lack of meaningful distractions. He sighed and focused in on the feathers on the ground to eavesdrop on the small group that had formed and was pointing up at him. He picked up on the disappointed words over the fact that he wasn't coming down for a few seconds to chat. They seemed to respect a hero who was focused, but Hawks was usually good at multitasking and ignoring the group was a little weird for him. Keigo gave the thought of going down for a full 4 seconds before he dismissed it. This high, Keigo didn't have to plaster on a fake smile and choke out even faker jokes. The idea of having to do that song and dance right now made his skin crawl. It wasn't like he couldn't ignore the various people waving up at him though, so he put on a bit of a show for them from the air. Many dives and rolls later with feathers arching up and away in fun patterns, Keigo moved on. He was having a bit of an off day and he hoped that this would be enough. He really didn't want to get a phone call, or even worse a visit, from his handler. She wasn't near as bad as the one that he'd had growing up, but her face was stone, literally, and impossible for Keigo to read. She made him uncomfortable as he couldn't tell what she was thinking, ever, so he just worked hard to avoid her as much as he could. The commission was well aware of the aversion he had and instead of using it to their advantage they'd make sure to only send her when he'd really messed up. Most of their interactions were over text or in anonymous drop-offs of files into his apartment. It was nice having a bit more freedom normally, but he knew that if the commission got even a single whiff of what he was up to she'd be sent and any freedoms he'd been able to claw out of the commission would be gone. If he was being honest with himself this might be enough to be terminated. Keigo flew to a roof and sat on the edge. He kicked out his feet, biting down on his lip hard enough to draw blood. He gripped his hair and yanked hard. He held his breath knowing if he'd scream if he let the air leave his lungs. It didn't make sense. He didn't know why this whole situation was affecting him. Hawks had helped free kids half as young and in twice as messed up positions as Izuku. Keigo knew firsthand that the commission took pretty good care of their assets. Izuku was in no real danger. They'd never let one of their toys get totally obliterated unless they had a spare. And Keigo doubted they had another healing quirk in their pocket that was of his caliber from the lengths they seemed to go to get the kid under their control. Ergo, Izuku would be fine. The kid would still be breathing and alive even if it took them a few weeks before Eraser had gathered the intel and heroes needed for the rescue. However, the little voice in the back of Keigo's head was screaming that the gap between alive and okay was as close as Earth was to the moon. And worse yet that the commission was more than fine with keeping their favorite pets in the vacuum of space between the two. More so if they felt that it was in the HPSC's best interest. Keigo felt his wings shudder and puff up, curling around his shoulders like a protective shawl. A vice ratcheted around his lungs suddenly making it difficult to breathe. He needed to leave. He needed to move. He needed air. Before he knew it, Keigo was tumbling towards the pavement. Sloppy. He caught himself and shot off into the sky. Once above the buildings, he pushed himself to go as fast as he could. He needed to go. He couldn't be here anymore. He angled his wings into a slipstream adding a boost to his breakneck pace. The anxiety and fear couldn't catch him this fast. The wind whipped his hair in a way that soothed the constant aching desire to be preened. The roar of the wind filled his ears, drowning out any of the spiraling thoughts. The warmth of the sun on his back and feathers left him feeling unstoppable and invincible. Each beat of his wings was a bellows stoking the burning fire that started along his back and shoulders but wrapped all the way around his chest. The fire burned away everything but the need to get away which propelled him further and further away. Seeing the ocean below him finally snapped Keigo out of his mad dash. Slowing to a circling glide he looked around. The water shimmered in the midday sun. The enclosed bay was fully visible from his view and small boats bobbed in the water. A city rose up on both sides of the bay, but the one to the east was larger and had a few recognizable buildings. It was Kumamoto. Hawks checked his phone with a tight grip. Only about 10 minutes had passed. He had gone about 100 km in 10 minutes. Holy s. 600 km/h even with wind was insane. Last time he'd been tested his top speed was just shy of 400 km/h. He couldn't do that forever but he had the stamina to keep that up for a good half an hour. No wonder his flight muscles hurt and his face felt wind-burned and numb. Keigo glided down to the nearby shoreline. The sand was sure to get into his feathers, boots and flight suit, but it was too late now. He stood on the sandy shore and let his head tilt back with a sigh. He closed his eyes to soak up the warm afternoon sun on his face. His wings shook a little before he let them rest on the soft sand. There was no way he could shake off that little stunt as part of some embarrassment. The HPSC would be sending his handler in person, he just knew it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. That was probably them, and there was no way he was answering right now. He was going to ignore them for as long as he could. They were already angry, so what's the point? It's not like responding promptly ever lessened the punishments. Keigo also knew that being in the public eye kept him safe from the worst punishments now, so he could ignore the phone call. He could also ignore the zing of anxiety that shot through his body and left his fingers and toes tingling as his phone stopped buzzing only to start buzzing again not even 2 seconds later. It was fine. It was fine. Keigo shifted his wings in the sand, cutting a semicircle around him. The grit of sand felt amazing and he started pressing his wings deeper and deeper into the sand. A part of him wanted to lay down and wiggle on his back like a dog scratching their own back, but held himself back. He relaxed his wings, stopping the slow stirring he had been doing, and focused on anything but his animalistic desires. He took a few deep and metered breaths, counting along with the low waves lapping at the shoreline. It was pretty, soothing. The shine of the sun on the crystal blue waves looked like glitter. The faded greens and grays of the further shoreline cut the vibrant blues of the ocean and sky like the wide cracks in an old sidewalk. The smell of the salt brine in the air mixed with sunscreen and a distant cart selling fried food of some kind. The soft crashing waves and the distant sounds of laughter from a group of young adults playing volleyball slowly unwound the hero. They sounded so carefree that Keigo couldn't help but smile. As a hero, it was his job to take the hard things onto himself so others can have those carefree joyful moments. He could do that. Keigo felt his smile widen as he looked over the ocean one more time as he shook out some of the sand from his wings. He felt like he was shaking out the nonsense that had been plaguing him all day, all week as he got the sand out. Keigo could be Hawks, and Hawks could be the hero that those happy civilians needed. Hawks could save people with incredible speed and a playful smirk. Hawks could save Izuku. He turned to walk away and his stomach growled loudly. He felt his face flush with embarrassment. Hawks could save everyone after lunch. After a nice lunch of teriyaki chicken and an awkward phone call, he was as free as a bird. The call was with one of his agency's sidekicks and it went. But looking on the positive side, he was able to talk his way out of the psych eval and mandatory 3 days off and instead just got the rest of his shift covered with the promise he'd talk to her in person the next day. Heron was a mother hen at times, but she's been a sidekick for as long as Keigo has been alive, and she seemed to have decided to take him under her wing the moment she laid eyes on him. Her going out on a limb and fudging protocol was nice of her. He didn't realize there was even a protocol for when a hero answered a texted question of, "Why'd you fly 100 kilometers south? Are you good?" with, "I think I just had a panic attack and flew really fast lol." Apparently this sort of interaction fell under signs of mental strain and or fatigue, and was wildly concerning, not funny. Good to know for the future. No jokes about panic attacks. Especially with Heron. Having the rest of the day to leisurely make his way back to his apartment was nice at least. The lack of pressure of having to be an effective and proper hero was also nice. The unending looping thoughts loosened from their suffocating spirals around his lungs, allowing Keigo to breathe for what felt like the first time in weeks. Sitting back on the beach with his toes in the sand was also probably helping. Beaches were second only to flying high in the sky for calming locations. The Hawks HPSC approved PR answer to why he likes beaches so much would be something along the lines of a joke about how he liked to show off his amazing hero abs and seeing all the cuties in their swimwear, finishing off with a flirty wink. But in reality, Keigo liked the steady rhythms that he could get lost in. The waves moved in a constant rolling rainstick of rushing and curling water, shifting in and out along the sand. A crab's legs looked like a wind-up toy as its legs hit 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 as it darted across the sand. A swimmer's arms curling up and then back into the water at an even tempo. Even the squawking cries of the seagulls had a consistent back and forth, making Keigo want to join in with his own raptor calls. He never joined in, but his base instincts wanted to see how they would react to his own piercing screams, but the HPSC would have an actual conniption fit if he did something like that in public. Keigo leaned back and slowly started swirling his wings into the sand. Getting the sand out of his wings was an absolute pain, but it was able to scratch the itchy skin that no matter how hard he tried his fingers just couldn't quite scratch right. This is why beaches are better than the very close third of forests for calmest locations. Can't sand bathe in a forest, usually. He sighed as the sand finally reached the dry itchy skin of his wings, letting out a quiet coo. With his mouth closed it could be mistaken as weird humming, so he wasn't too concerned and let himself coo again. He shouldn't lean into his more bird-like tendencies, as letting loose a few times usually lead to him losing control of the harder-to-hide ones. But he'd had a bad day. And from the outside this was just a guy playing with sand and humming, not a weird bird freak having a dirt bath and making happy bird noises. A shiver shot up his spine as he felt one of the many pin feathers he couldn't quite reach between his shoulder blades finally cracked its casing. He bit back a full-on happy screaming call and scrambled to sit back up. He needed to get back to Kyushu. He shouldn't even be here, and he's wasted enough time already. He slammed his feet back into his boots, ignoring the bunches of sand he laced them up. It's not like he uses them for more than landing and takeoff anyway. Why walk when you could fly? After standing he closed his eyes and concentrated on vibrating every individual feather on his wings in a vague attempt to shake out as much of the sand as he could. It was a little overwhelming feeling all the sand shake out and the feathers knock into each other. But it wasn't quite enough stimulus to drown out the feeling of small shaking hands clasp onto the distant feather. Keigo froze, totally zoned into the sporadic tapping. Everything else around him fell away as he struggled to decipher the garbled Morse code. You there, Kei? Keigo felt a strange mix of bubbling excitement over the nickname and anxiety over how early Izuku was reaching out to him. He'd told Keigo that he usually talked to him after he finished his school work for the day. Keigo prayed that the kid's big day was actually just exams that ended up letting out earlier than normal. Always Izu. It was a little forward to give the kid a nickname back without asking, but the kid shortened his name and Morse code was tedious. I can't. The tapping was so shaky after that even though Keigo was really trying to put the unsteady stuttering Morse code together, but it just was unintelligible. The gaping hole that had been punched through his stomach widened. The tapping stopped and he reached out with the feather to tap back. You can't do this anymore. It hurts. Make it stop. The return response was slower and more steady, but the content sent adrenaline pumping through his veins. Keigo reminded himself that he was a hero and was trained for this sort of thing. He took a breath and responded as Hawks. What hurts? Everything. Ice shot through Keigo's chest and out to his hands and feet. He started to feel numb and tingly and focused even further into the feather that was in Izuku's hands. It was pressed against what had to be the kid's face as it started to vibrate with muttered words, or possibly sobbing. Keigo wasn't quite able to make it out and it gutted him. He should have left more than one feather, then the kid could have just been able to talk, none of this Morse code nonsense. Trying to tap out soothing words to Izuku only made Keigo feel like an even greater failure as the kid just tightened his grip on the feather, pressing it deeper into his soft cheek. Needing to change tactics, Keigo started to just softly stoke the tip of the feather against his cheek. After what felt like an eternity just focused on the soft cheek and slight dampness of what had to be tears, Izuku finally tapped out a response. Sorry. Keigo hated that. The kid shouldn't feel like he needs to apologize for crying. It's fine. You okay? There was a pause. A long pause. Too long of a pause where Izuku just stroked along the thin shaft from the tip to the quill with a shaking finger. After an eternity the stroking slowed and the pressure of the kid's full hand rested gently on the feather and a finger started to tap along the barbs. N.O. The hand shifted before a rushed set of letters were tapped. Bleeding again. Keigo didn't have any memory of taking off, but suddenly he was in the air heading off towards the kid. The soft pressure of the kid's trembling hand guiding his path. Where? There was no response. Keigo pumped his wings faster and faster. Where bleed? The flat pressure shifted to curve around the feather in a weak grasp. Keigo tried one more time for a response. Izu, please respond. A shuddering spasm went through the small hand clutching his feather. It snapped. Keigo's breath stopped as the fading sensations from the feather filled his whole mind. The dripping wetness, the still hand loosely around the break, the flat surface the tip and quill rested on now that the feather was in two. He zeroed in on any dregs of sensation as the feather's ability lowered to nothing more than a general location. Keigo heard a distant shout and snapped open his eyes. He was practically in a nose dive and snapped his wings back open and caught himself before he hit the ground below him. Thank goodness for that person, or he would probably be a smear on the pavement. He tried to follow the broken feather's faded sensations only to feel a different feather shift in a different direction. It must have been in a pocket and jostled against a much larger calloused hand. Eraserhead. Aizawa Shota. Rolling his wings into a tight turn, he set a new trajectory. He flapped his wings even harder and wished for another slipstream as his flight muscles screamed at him. Izuku needed saving now. Keigo prayed that Eraserhead's reputation as extremely efficient was accurate. Aizawa had just finished explaining everything that he had learned about both Midoriya's to Nezu when he felt something tug in his pocket. The small red feather that Hawks had given him zoomed away from him and zipped over to the window. Shota felt his face twist in confusion as the feather started clicking against the glass. Nezu chuckled as he lifted his teacup to his constantly grinning mouth. Nezu's chipper, incoming, was Shota's only real warning before the large red blur that was pro-hero. Hawks smashed through the window. The young hero hit the ground in a tangled pretzel of limbs and wings. His face was now bleeding from numerous cuts from the broken glass that filled the room like confetti. Shota was on his feet in an instant, his practiced hands pulling out the first aid kit from his utility belt. Kneeling carefully to avoid giving himself any cuts, a shot of anxiety struck him about how still Keigo was. If the kid was unconscious after smashing himself through triple pane glass windows, he was going to feel no sympathy if Hawks complained about a headache later. Heck, if the kid gave himself a concussion, it might be a good thing so he learns to slow down. When Shota's hands got close to his bleeding temple, Keigo lunged. He grabbed Shota's wrists so tight it was sure to bruise. Hawks, Shota grunted as the grip compressed even tighter. He felt his bones start to grind together. Ow, Hawks, Hawks, quote. Shota was now worried that the kid was going to squeeze his wrists so tight they would break. He was sure it was all in his mind, but he swore he could hear his bones creak like old wood as the obviously panicking Keigo kept squeezing impossibly tighter. Shota hissed through his teeth. Keigo. Unnaturally fast, Keigo's head twisted to look at Shota. Something flip-flopped in his gut as he watched Keigo's gold eyes dilate and flip rapidly between almost all black with the thinnest ring of iris to almost all gold with just a pinprick of the pupil. It didn't really seem like the kid was all there, and Shota had a feeling that it wasn't from a concussion from the window. Something had made him rocket himself into Nezu's office. Shota was no expert in human behavior, but this was no normal afternoon activity. It screamed of distressed panic. Nezu started to move towards the two, only for Hawks to let out the most blood-curdling animalistic screech. Nezu froze and Shota flinched. It was honestly loud enough to make his ears ring and already aching head throb. Shortly after the screech finished, the kid started thrashing. Shota tried to stop him, but it wasn't very effective from his position crouched on his knees and both hands basically in human vice grips. Shota winced as he watched glass dig its way into Keigo's arms and legs. Shota darted his eyes over to the now puffed-up principal. They exchanged glances before Nezu nodded and backed away. Shota isn't sure how Hawks could sense Nezu from behind him, but once he was further away, Keigo's thrashing transitioned into him being flopped on the floor. Full-body shivers racked him as he kept a hold on Shota's wrists. Keigo's sharp fingernails had curled into the soft skin of the underside of his wrist. Little beads of blood welled up and rolled down the palms of Shota's hands. Keigo, you have to let go or let Nezu get closer. Shota tried really hard to smooth out his low gravelly voice into anything remotely soothing. It clearly wasn't enough as Keigo's nails dug deeper into his skin, making Shota quietly gasp in pain. The kid shook his head vigorously and Shota held back a sigh. You need to let me help. You're bleeding. Somewhere in Keigo's brain wires must have gotten crossed in this full-blown freak-out, or maybe it was smashing through the window. Shota didn't really know, and he didn't really care beyond the minor embarrassment as the kid took every single one of his efforts to calm him as signals to freak out more. And, oh boy, did he freak out more. Feathers shot out in every direction, lucky not sharpened, as he let out a series of loud distressed bird call screams. All 6 of his limbs started thrashing once more, but now somehow with more vigor. Feathers were now knocking paintings off the walls, and a few sharpened just as they hit the furniture, embedding themselves in the cushions. Hawks was kicking up the shattered glass into the air and digging the bits embedded deeper into him. Annoyingly, through all of this, the grip on Aizawa's wrist stayed incredibly steady, and he had no choice but to try to dodge the flying glass, feathers, and limbs. It reminded him of some of the absolute hellish trainings Nezu had forced on him during his own time as a UA student. He held out for a decent amount of time until he dodged a handful of glass from getting him in his eyes, only for his eyes to widen as a muscular wing came from the other direction, hard and fast, right into the bridge of his nose. The loud snapping pop and searing pain made Shota's eyes water. He could feel how his nose was broken and now slightly displaced. The warm bubbling blood flowed down his face. He growled. He was done with this f***ing s. Shota was running on next to no sleep, too many cups of coffee, and the absolute worst timing. He'd told Recovery Girl he'd try to stop smoking, so the pounding headache of nicotine withdrawal about quadrupled with the addition of a broken nose. He activated his quirk, making all the feathers not attached to the still thrashing kid drop to the floor. Seeing an opening, Shota jumped up and over Hawk's shoulder to couch between his wings. Keigo's arms were now crossed tightly to his chest, a straight jacket of his own making. Shota moved his elbows to guide the still flapping wings forward. It was a bad recreation of the self-soothing position Shota'd seen the kid make the previous night. Something about it seemed to sort of calm Keigo, where he was getting tired as he switched to mainly jerking his shoulders like he was trying to buck Shota off his back. Joke's on the kid, this was far from his first rodeo in restraining panicking teens who were dangers to themselves or others. Some days, being a high school teacher was hell. Once Shota was fairly sure Keigo was calm, in relative terms, he dropped his quirk. He counted to 3 and with no additional feathers exploding from the older teen, gave himself a little nod and used his foot to shift the dropped first aid kit closer to him. The awkward contortions of using his knees, elbows, and toes to twist himself to get the kit up to one of his still trapped hands reminded Shota of the importance of stretching. Next time his class complained about stretching, he would make his class do this exact thing as a drill. Maybe even come up with a few other horrible contortionist-adjacent activities. Might save their lives, or someone else's life. Finally, with the kit in one of his hands, he worked to try to open it with one hand. Keigo jerked forward just as Shota got a single gauze packet out of the kit. The rest of the kit fell and spread across the floor, mixing with the glass. Shota bit back a frustrated growl. He ripped the packet open with his teeth and slapped it over the worst cut that was visibly free of glass on his temple. Shota moved his other hand to press onto the other side of head when he flinched away from the highly questionable first aid. Feeling the blood seep through the gauze and mix with his own blood on his palms, Shota let out the growl. It wasn't Keigo's fault, not really. He was having a full-on meltdown over something. Probably the pressure of the tasks Shota had given him. He'd worried it would be too much to pretend to be normal, but this seemed extreme. But it was clear the kid was absolutely traumatized from whatever the HPSC did to him, so maybe it's Shota's fault for not taking that more into account. Hawks, Keigo, I need you to breathe and try to calm down. You need first aid, you are bleeding. Not me. Keigo's voice sounded strangled and strange, split between ethereal and eerie, as a slightly quieter screeching came out over the top of the words. He tried to shake his head, but couldn't as Shota was working hard to keep his head still. Not me, not me, not me, quote. Shota wished his nose wasn't broken or he would lean his head forward to hit Keigo's back with a sigh. Instead, Shota just let out a long sigh. This didn't make any sense and he was getting nowhere. Irritation boiled under his skin. He was just about to spit out something he knew he would regret when Nezu piped in from the corner. What do you mean, Keigo-kun? The two chipper words caught Keigo's attention and the hero froze. Not me, Izu. Quote, what about Izuku-kun? He's bleeding. Shota couldn't see his face but he sounded wrecked. Keigo started to try to rock softly forward and backward, this time in a self-soothing pattern. Shota loosened his grip on the sides of his face, moving with the kid. Asked for help. Begged. In pain. Lots of pain. Bleeding. Snapped feather. Can't reach him. The kid let out a hiccuping sob as he sank back into Shota's chest. Can't help and he's bleeding. After saying that, Hawks crumpled like a wind-up toy who finished its spring. The tight hands around Shota's wrists finally let go. Shota slipped his hand out and stretched out his fingers, feeling as the blood flooded back into them. Keigo's arms thumped into his lap. Shota couldn't see his face in full, but he could tell it was slack. Shota furrowed his brows with a deep frown as he started applying some less questionable first aid to the kid. Tweezers dyed red as band-aids and medical tape was added to the kid's face, arms and legs. Shota thought he saw some blood coming from in between some of the feathers in one of Hawk's wings but couldn't really get down to skin without the vacant kid shifting away. He worked efficiently and in no time at all he was rubbing his own antibiotic ointment and bandages around the crescent-shaped cuts on his wrists. He ignored the now drying blood on his upper lip and chin. It would just start bleeding again when Recovery Girl said it, so it was illogical to clean up until after then. Shota was gingerly poking at his nose when Nezu cleared his throat. I've cleaned up as much of the glass as I could. If you could move Keigo-kun to the couch I can finish. Shota glanced over at his boss. In his small paws was a small broom and dustpan, which he was using to gesture towards the couch furthest from the now broken window. Shota's knees popped as he stood awkwardly crouched over to hold Keigo sitting upright. Shota stepped over his shoulder, careful to not kick his head, only to crunch some glass under his boot. Keigo flinched at the noise which surprised Shota. The kid looked so zoned out and his eyes were glazed and half-lidded, but was still at some level aware of his surroundings which, Shota decided to take it as a positive thing of maybe Keigo slowly working his way out of it and not a sign of alarming hypervigilance. As slowly as he possibly could, Shota reached out and lifted Keigo up and over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The loose wings were an added obstacle forcing Shota to awkwardly shuffle to avoid stepping on the now ruffled, glass-filled feathers. With a grunt he lowered the kid to lay on his side. Shota maneuvered his arms and wings to not be trapped in any way, hoping that it was a comfortable position. Making him comfortable was the only thing that Shota could do for Keigo at this point. He hated that there wasn't anything that he could really do to fix whatever this was exactly. The kid was obviously as close to okay as Shota was to Venus, which is to say, not at all. Behind the distant, glassy eyes, Keigo looked exhausted and scared. Shota's hands started feeling twitchy, like they needed to do something to help the distressed kid in front of him. Impulsively, Shota leaned forward and ran his fingers through the dirty blonde, windswept hair. Keigo let out a soft, slightly surprised coo before he leaned into the hand. His eyes closed as Shota ran his hand through the hair a few more times. With each stroke, the clear distress on his face faded into a blissful relaxed expression. Small coos and happy huffs fell out from between lax lips. Shota couldn't help but smile as Keigo nuzzled his head into the cushion below his head and curled one of his wings up and over his body. A hand reached up and over the edge of the fluffy red wings like a child might hold the edge of a blanket. It took Shota an embarrassingly long time to compose himself and turn back to his boss. The wide, knowing grin on Nezu's face made Shota scowl. "Shall I get adoption papers made up?" Shota crossed the room to Nezu's desk and collapsed into one of the plush chairs. "Is now really the time to be joking?" "Ah, likely not." Nezu skittered up and into his own large plush desk chair. He tapped the disheveled pile of papers onto the desk a few times, forcing them into order and placed them back into the file. "I'd hoped for more time to perform any amount of reconnaissance. But from this update we may need to update the schedule and improvise as we go as it seems like time is of the essence." What an understatement. Shota dragged a hand over his face only to immediately regret touching his broken nose. He felt something gush inside his face and only barely moved fast enough to cup a hand under his face to catch the spurt of blood that fell out. Nezu handed Shota a very nice-looking embroidered handkerchief which he didn't think twice about holding up to his bleeding nose, undoubtedly ruining it. Served the rat right for treating Shota's capture scarf like his own personal nest and his shoulder like his own personal ride. Really, Shota usually didn't care, but the additional wear and fraying from the principal's kneading with his claws lead to him having to get scarves more often. And Shota had just gotten this one about a week ago. Looking down at the now large splatters of quickly drying blood, he sighed. Hazashi would force him to get a new one at least for classes, as blood stains were fine for villain intimidation but not for students. What a pain. A soft warbling noise came from the far side of the room and Shota sighed again. I don't think Hawks should be on the team. I don't think we really have a choice, Shota-kun. Nedzu clasped his paws together in front of him on the desk with a sigh. He is the only one who has any ability to pinpoint exactly where Izuku-kun is being held. I might be able to use hacked cameras once at the facility, but that might be impossible. And regardless, we will need Hawks to help point us to the greater area we need to be headed in. Shota slumped forward, using only his elbows on his knees to prop himself up. A large wave of exhaustion rushed over him. I know. He ground his teeth together. I just don't like it. Twisting to look over his shoulder, Shota watched the very much vacant Keigo curled up on the couch. He pointed with his thumb as he turned back to look at his boss. If this is his response at this stage, he will be a liability. And if Izuku is found dead, flashes of more feather-filled meltdowns filled Shota's mind before Nedzu's voice cut in. We will just have to rescue the boy post-haste then. The grin that stretched across Nedzu's face was balanced on a razor's edge between normal and feral. A shiver ran down Shota's spine. Now, Nedzu clapped his little paws together as the grin widened, sliding off the fine line and settled squarely on the feral side. Let's get down to business. Nedzu was out for blood, which never failed to be terrifying. Shota, not for the first time, was eternally grateful that he and Nedzu were on the same side. It was only a few hours later when the small team of rogue heroes pulled up to a forested area close to, but hidden from, the commission facility. The heroes were all sitting around in the back of the van. Nedzu was sitting in the far back on a computer. He was connecting to the security network. Hacking was not one of Shota's handful of illegal-seeming talents, so he had no idea what exactly the rat was doing as he clacked on the keyboard. But the manic grin implied that he was having a good time. Which was objectively terrifying. Keigo sat right across from Shota, and he was concerned. The harsh concentration that furrowed Keigo's eyebrows and twisted his mouth into a severe frown felt wrong. Only about an hour or so ago the kid was still blinking back the haze from his impromptu nap on Nedzu's couch after having a total meltdown. Shota doubted that Keigo was actually over the dramatic reaction he'd had to Izuku's message, but instead had pushed it to the side. It was a thing the kid had to have done hundreds, if not thousands, of times from how he was able to switch on a dime back into focused hero mode. It left a bad taste in Shota's mouth. Bottling up these sorts of things didn't end well, as he knew more than most. The downturned corners of his mouth deepened. Having Hawks here was a bad idea. The kid was a bit of a ticking time bomb, and Shota hoped the explosion would be where Keigo was safe to go off and not inside the facility. A shoulder bumped into Shota's shoulder. He blinked up at the concerned look of his fiance. Hazashi's hero persona was nowhere to be found, both in the serious expression on his face and also in the generic black tactical uniform they were all wearing and the simple golden braid tossed over his shoulder. Hazashi's eyes twitched back and forth, not even trying to hide how intensely he was searching Shota's face. He must have seen something as his eyes warmed and he threw Shota a reassuring smile. Stop worrying so hard. He leaned forward to whisper right into Shota's ear. The low tone and air hitting his cheek made him shiver. He is a good hero, trust him. It's just in and out. It'll be easy. Shota shot his fiancé a flat look. That's easy for you to say, Mr. Getaway Driver who gets to stay in the van. Hazashi shrugged with a playful smile. What can I say? I'm here to keep us legal. I don't think any of this is all that legal, Hazashi. Ah, that's where you are wrong, my sweet Shota. The biggest, cheesiest grin was paired with matching annoying finger guns. I'm the only one here with a driver's license and I'm the one driving. So it's all totally legal. If we get caught and get a trial, I want you to say that word for word. I want to see the judge have an aneurysm. You got it, babe. Hazashi gave him a wink which Shota rolled his eyes at. He hated to admit it, but the idiotic conversation did make him feel better. He leaned into Hazashi's shoulder a little bit and Hazashi reached an arm around his shoulder and squeezed him in. Being like this made it a little easier to breathe. An excited chittering from the corner made all the heroes turn to Nezu. You in, Nimari, who'd been quiet since she got brought in on this half-baked plan, finally piped in. It felt wrong only having her give one single half-hearted joke about how she was being repressed, stating that she needed a skin-tight catsuit, not some standard tactical outfit. It made Shota feel a little less nervous that she seemed to have settled a bit. Nimari had struggled with child trafficking cases for years now. Shota still remembered watching her break down in a karaoke bar as she choked the story out through tears. It was her first year as a full-fledged hero and the heroes were too late. The traffickers decided to cut their losses and kill all 20 or so kids and teens that they had when they got a whiff of the heroes being on their tail. Nimari had given vivid descriptions of dead poisoned children as an upbeat pop song played in the back of the bar. Shota had struggled to sleep that evening, and can't imagine how much it must have wrecked Nimari. This kid was in a totally different circumstance, but Shota had learned that emotions are irrational and don't care about that sort of thing, much to his chagrin. He trusted Nimari to be professional and keep a level head even with her history. He trusted her with not only his life but Hazashi's life, too. But being the only one on the extraction team that wasn't totally thrown off kilter by this case was setting his teeth on edge. Emotions this high can lead to mistakes no matter how hard a hero is able to compartmentalize. This was a mess and he was trying really hard to avoid being pessimistic, but it was getting harder every passing second. I have been able to loop all the cameras to the security feed. I have also secured a map of the facility and will be able to lead you out once you all are able to extract Izuku-kun. Nezu handed out the in-ear comms. As the extraction team ready? Shota didn't feel ready. He wanted more time. He wanted more information. He wished he at least had a cigarette to calm his nerves. But annoyingly, he'd handed Recovery Girl his last pack when she, red in the face and about ready to blow a gasket, came to Nezu's office to set Shota's broken nose. Handing over the box had appeased her just enough to save him from another, much worse, lecture. He could feel the waves of frustration over the fact that it had been just about 24 hours since her last lecture and he still hadn't really rested in any meaningful way, had a broken nose, lightly sprained and bleeding wrists, still hadn't healed from his shoulder injury, and was about to go on a dangerous raid. As he couldn't get kissed by her to make all of that go away in fear he would slip into a possible coma from drawing too much stamina. She had growled at him as she slapped prescription-grade acetaminophen and glared at Nezu. She'd told him through grit teeth that she'd be ready for everyone when they returned, and they better all be in one piece, or without any additional injuries. The last bit was aimed at Shota and he couldn't even bring himself to be annoyed, as he'd also wished he'd stopped getting injured. Hazashi squeezed his arm, bringing Shota back to the present. He rubbed his hand up and down in an attempt to comfort him. Shota gave him a tight smile, which from Hazashi's deeper frown, probably came out more like a pained grimace. Slumping forward, Shota let his head hang loose, his long black fringe covered his eyes. He ed at being reassuring, which was part of why he went into underground heroics. You're a good hero, too, Sho. Hazashi moved his head to duck down to look at Shota's face. From the corner of his eye Shota saw his fiancée's wide smile. It's just like any other raid. Hazashi gave him one more squeeze before he stood and did an awkward half-crouched walk back to the driver's seat. Shota blankly watched as Hazashi disappeared behind the seat. It didn't feel like any other raid. A lot was riding on their success. Most importantly was the well-being of one Midoriya Izuku. He took a deep, centering breath and nodded to Nezu. I'm ready. Next time you see me we will have Izuku. Nezu nodded with a grin. The extraction team jumped out of the back of the van, securing the comms and gas masks onto their faces. Shota hoped that he wasn't lying. He was going to do whatever it took to get this kid. Getting into the building was surprisingly simple. Hawks carried Midnight to the roof, flying silently as Eraserhead used his capture weapon. Eraserhead had gotten flack for his illegal-seeming skills for years. But lockpicking had been useful again and again, and once more it was coming in handy. Using a rake pick he was able to open the roof access door in less than 20 seconds. That made all the years of nonsense from law enforcement worth it. The three heroes ran with light feet into the facility. The inside of the building felt clinical. The white tile, white walls, uncomfortable-looking plastic chairs against the hull with the random indoor plants and bland decor hung between the various doors all just screamed generic medical location. Hawks took point as their guide to Izuku as there was no camera showing Izuku according to Nedzu. Midnight was second to take out any agents with her gas quirk and Eraserhead was last. The hallway twisted and turned until they got to a door to a stairway, where Hawks aggressively threw open the door. Luckily Midnight caught the door before it slammed into the wall. Shota grimaced. This was the type of thing he was worried about. Keigo looked sheepish enough for Shota to drop it but it didn't fill him with confidence. Keigo jumped down the center of the twisting staircase to just drop 3 stories, and caught himself with a snap of his wings. Midnight gave Shota a puppy dog look and he sighed, wrapping an arm around her waist. She grabbed onto his shoulder tightly with a grin, unfortunately it was the one that had the puncture wound in it. She shifted her grip at the pained huff he let out. He shot his capture weapon out to wrap around the handrail. He then threw himself and Midnight over the railing and rappelled them both down to where Hawks was pacing by a closed door. Shota wished he could see all of Keigo's face, but beyond the obvious reasons, the gas masks were to assist in obscuring their identities. He thought that was fruitless as the 3 of them had very unique quirks and Eraserhead was one of maybe 3 heroes in Japan that used a capture weapon, and the other 2 used it as a backup and not as their main weapon. The kid was shifting and his eyes were flicking all over the place. It was too late to switch up plans at this point so Shota would just have to keep an eye on Keigo and hope for the best. Nimari poked her head out of the door only to motion that it was clear. The 3 were once again silently running down more winding hallways before Hawks abruptly halted in front of a closed wooden office door. The comm beeped before Shota's boss's voice filled his hearing. There are 6 agents behind this door. They are all sitting at desks against the walls, doing computer work. Eraserhead nodded directly into the nearest camera. Midnight unzipped the zippers sewn into her sleeves revealing a long strip of skin from her shoulders down to her elbow. Purple gas started to waft off of her as she nodded to Eraserhead, who cracked the door open just ever so slightly. Hawks used a few hand-length feathers to make a small fan angling the gas to funnel into the cracked door even quicker. Shota held his breath as he listened for any signs that the agents noticed anything off. In no time at all the sounds of slumping bodies were followed by a few quiet snores. Opening it further, Eraserhead peeked ahead and to scan the room, ready to activate his quirk if needed. All of the various agents were in scrubs and collapsed over their desks or leaned back in their office chairs. He fully opened the door for the other heroes to enter. Hawks crossed the room to the opposite door and Midnight followed closely behind. Eraserhead started across the room but paused searching the files that were strewed out in front of and slightly under a sleeping agent, their keyboard pushed to the side. Her long blue and purple striped hair obscured a few of the pages, but between the strands Shota was able to see a complex-looking graph labeled, Panacea's Healing Output versus Input. Shota shifted the hair to only have his heart flip-flop. It was a photo of Izuku bleeding fairly heavily from his arms. Horrifyingly the kid was smiling even though the flash of the camera had lit the tear tracks making them look like they were glowing on his rounded cheeks. He shuffled the papers, gathering them as quickly as he could. He slipped a few sheets out from under the woman's face, leaving the single sheet that seemed stuck to her makeup. Leaving the one page was annoying but the file was fairly thick as is and gaining 20 to 30 pages of information with a few holes was better than nothing. He tucked the file into his shirt and ran out to the room and into the new hallway to catch up with Hawks and Midnight. They stood, paused in front of the next door as Eraserhead sprinted over. Next 2 rooms are attached by a single door, possibly locked. But Nedzu paused like he was at a loss for words. That made Shota incredibly nervous. It looks like they have yet to clean the second room. Ah, well, that's cryptic. But Shota shot the camera in the corner of the room a nod before flicking his eyes over to a still nervous Hawks. He was pretty sure he understood. That second room was likely to be triggering to the kid. Taking a deep breath, Eraserhead opened the door. This first room was clean and looked like any other hospital room. A simple medical bed was pushed against the far wall. A myriad of medical instruments hung on the walls above the head of the bed or were on carts or stands near that wall. There was a series of cabinets and a sink in one corner. Midnight crossed to the door. Her whispered, "It's locked," might as well have been a whip cracking in the silence, but got the point across quickly. Eraserhead moved around the frozen Kago, whose eyes stared intensely at the empty bed for some reason. His wings shifted between puffed up and totally sleek and smooth. Shota bit his lip as he crouched in front of the door. As he pulled out his kit he looked over his shoulder. The kid didn't seem too stressed, yet. Shota just hoped it stayed that way. The weight of his lock-picking kit in hand, Eraserhead focused back on the locked door. He pushed aside his worry to focus on applying steady pressure on his tension wrench and focused intensely on the small clicks of the pins of the lock. As the last pin clicked, he swung the door open. He couldn't help but let out a soft gasp at the sight and smell. The overwhelming antiseptic citric smell and blood mixed together so that even Shota with his stuffed up and broken nose under a gas mask couldn't help but gag a bit. He hoped Hawks had base human senses, but from the way the kid was covering the lower half of his face he felt the kid had enhanced senses. The room was a twisted mirror of the previous one. Just on the other side of the wall from the nice medical bed was a stainless steel table with raised sides. Seeing the drain, Shota realized it was an autopsy table. However, it must have been modified as most autopsy tables don't require heavy padded straps to hold a person down. The drain at the base of the table didn't have anything hooked up to it and just splattered directly onto the ground. A trail of diluted dried blood crossed the floor to a central drain. The blood was likely half-heartedly cleaned, explaining the citric bite in the air. Around the table were shelves which mocked the medical equipment in the previous room. They were filled with various glass containers filled with chemicals Shota didn't recognize the names of, plastic bins with names of torture devices on their labels, and a few kitchen knife blocks that looked a little blood-stained. He felt sick. Eraserhead had seen much worse in all reality, but no matter how many times he searched crime scenes it never failed to twist something in Shota's gut. Sometimes he wished he'd just hurry up and be desensitized, but something in him refused to let him. He darted his eyes over to Kago, checking in on the kid. And he almost regretted it. The kid's face was painfully blank, albeit a little pale. His golden eyes flicked over the room, looking totally blasé to the scene. Like this was what he expected and that this was normal. Shota swallowed back the creeping acid in the back of his throat, as his mind reeled, coming up with worse and worse things Kago might have dealt with as a child. No matter how blank the kid's face looked, his wings betrayed the repressed or hidden feelings simmering underneath. The feathers were sharp and glinted in the oppressive fluorescent lights. The wings were angled down like he was trying to make himself look bigger and more threatening. Shota just saw a cornered animal, a scared young man in too deep. Midnight's voice once more broke the silence. Not locked. She raised a hand to her comm in her ear. What's behind this door? No camera. Proceed with caution. Midnight opened the door, posed to release her quirk. The room was dark, lit only by the bright fluorescent lights from the doorway that bled into the entryway. There was the corner of a bright blue throw rug over the tile. It looked like it had a few faded stains, but was relatively clean. A bookshelf was against the wall just far enough to not be hit by the door swinging open. The large side of the shelf obscured a chunk of the view. The very edge of the light touched the far wall where there was a bed pushed into the corner. Next to it was a small bin, likely the source of the acidic smell of vomit. Tucked under a thin blanket was a person. Their head was obscured by the shelf, but the broken red feather tucked under a loose fist made it clear who it was. They'd finally found Izuku. Eraserhead stepped into the room and flicked on the light, and Midnight let out a strangled noise. Turning to the kid, now illuminated, Shota couldn't blame her. The kid looked wrecked. It wasn't clear if he was even still alive. Before Shota could even take a step, Hawks was kneeling beside the boy. His thin gloved fingers were against his neck, his other hand had his wrist held near Izuku's nose to check his breathing. The quiet word sent shivers down Shota's spine as he darted across the room to couch by the bed. Is he? Hawks cut him off. Breathing's shallow and uneven, pulses all over the place, and way too fast. From close up, Izuku looked even worse, if that was possible. His green hair was wet and oily, likely from fever, if the flush over his cheeks meant anything. The unhealthy pink stood out dramatically against the clammy pale white of the rest of his face. His closed eyes were puffy and looked swollen, possibly inflamed. Dark rings hung under them. The corners of his mouth looked bruised and cracked, his lips looked more blue than Shota felt comfortable with. Drool and blood mixed together, leaving a gory trail down the side of his face. The one arm over top of the blankets, holding onto the broken feather, had strange thin trailing welts. They were bright red and raised. In the crook of his arm was an IV that linked up to a clear bag. Shota assumed it was some fluids and maybe, hopefully, was some helpful medication. The rest of the boy was bundled under the light blue blanket. Shota hated how still the boy looked under the harsh lights, how dead he looked. They would have to move him, and he couldn't help but worry the kid wouldn't make it to the van, let alone the trip back to Ua. Indeed, Midnight mumbled. A little louder she continued, I'll keep watch. Shota let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and pulled down the blanket. The sight under the blanket was somehow worse. Izuku's other arm had the same trailing welts. He was wrapped in a crinkly, uncomfortable-looking hospital gown that had raised up a little, showing the blood-stained bottom edge of some All Might boxers. Izuku's thighs were tightly wrapped with gauze and the bandages were soaked through. The sheets had been stained where the kid must have kicked around before he fell unconscious. His feet were terribly swollen with the swelling going all the way up his calves. Small white pinpricks, that looked a little like inflamed pimples, covered his feet and ankles. Shota almost dismissed the large lump on Izuku's left shin for just more swelling, but looking closer his left foot was cocked a little strangely to the side and he realized the kid's shin bone was broken and was visibly displaced. Getting to work, Shota tossed Hawks a roll of bandages, which the young hero almost fumbled. Add more to his legs. We can't have him lose any more blood. Hawks nodded and mechanically started on his task with precision. Shota watched briefly, making sure Keigo wasn't about to lose it, before turning looking for anything to use as a splint. The room wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. The bookshelf was half full of folded clothes and half full of notebooks and various little hero-themed knickknacks. Against the other wall was a desk. On top of it was a straight edge laid out over a drawing of what looked like some tunnel system over a floor plan. Probably vents. Shota felt himself smile at the little childish doodles of various heroes around the edges as he grabbed the straight edge. Searching the drawers for anything else that could work well for a splint, he came up fairly empty. Turning to the notebooks on the book sleeves, he took one. The cover of the notebook said, Hero Analysis for the Future Volume 11 feet. Shota couldn't help but smile again as he crossed back to the boy and tied the straight edge and notebook to the broken leg. It wouldn't be great, but it would be better than nothing. Hawks had finished wrapping his thighs at about the same time Shota finished. He frowned down at the welts around his arms and the swollen feet. He wasn't sure exactly what caused either of them and wasn't sure what to do to make them better. Coving them seemed like the wrong call with the amount of swelling and inflammation, so he decided to leave them for Recovery Girl to figure out. He moved to take the IV off the wall when a loud screeching alarm went off. Looked like their time was up. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.